Kim Jong-un is preparing North Korea for war, and that war is going to happen sooner rather than later. That's the message delivered by 38 North, a publication from the Stimson Center that specializes in North Korean affairs, as it says that the situation in the Korean peninsula is more dangerous now than it's been at any time since 1950. The publication goes further. Like his grandfather before in 1950, Kim Jong-un has made a strategic decision to go to war. But will North Korea really start a war in 2024? To find the answer, we need to dig into what Kim Jong-un has been saying in recent months, and more tellingly what he's been doing. Let's start with the rhetoric. On January 18, 2024, the RAND Corporation, or RAND, published an article that highlighted 2023 claims by South Korea's National Intelligence Service that North Korea was likely to start using unexpected cyber and military provocations in 2024. The news was just the latest that suggests that Kim Jong-un is gearing up for conflict, and the words coming out of the leader's mouth seem to align with the theory. Take what he said at the end of 2023 as an example. During the course of 5 days of year-end meetings with his allies, Kim claimed that the United States poses various types of military threat, wrapping up on the final day of meetings by telling his military that it needs to maintain an overwhelming war response capability. As is usually the case, Kim is placing all the blame on North Korea's enemies, though his message indicates that he believes that war could break out in the Korean peninsula at any time. While he claims an invasion would force that to happen, the greater likelihood is that he's going to be the one who starts the fight. But hold on a second. Yes, the claim that Pyongyang needs to be ready for war at any time is a serious one, but is it really much different from the claims that Kim has made before? After all, this is a man known for his constant provocations, both of the US and South Korea, and so these comments could just be more of a series of seemingly empty threats. That seems unlikely to be the case. Honing in on Kim's provocations, there's no denying that they've both grown more frequent and more dangerous over the last decade or so. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, breaks it all down into numbers. This data reveals that provocations from North Korea have increased dramatically since the presidency of George W. Bush. When Bush was in office, North Korea made an average of 3.5 provocations per year. That ramped up to 10.88 per year when Barack Obama was in office and stayed somewhat stable during Donald Trump's presidency, declining only slightly to 10.25 per year. Then Joe Biden took office and Kim Jong-un seemed to grow bolder. CSIS said the United States has recorded an average of 30.33 provocations per year since Biden was elected, around triple what they were during the previous 2 administrations, creating a total of 91 North Korean provocations during Biden's tenure in office. These provocations don't solely come in the form of rhetoric. CSIS says that North Korea has been ramping up its missile testing, with each test launch being a provocation, and many of its tests aren't related to experimental equipment. Kim is testing weapons that he already has to make sure that they're combat ready when the time comes. Something has changed in Kim's approach to war. According to DW, that change is linked to the abandonment of North Korea's approach to the United States. Over the last few years, Pyongyang has looked to normalize relationships with the US as best it could. However, according to DW, Kim may now believe that such normalization is impossible. It claims that many analysts are underestimating just how important this desire for normalization was in terms of Kim not turning his threats of war into action. With that guardrail removed, there's now very little stopping him from following through on all of the talk and actually launching an attack. We can trace this change of internal policy to 2019 and the Hanoi summit between Kim and then US President Donald Trump. At that time, the talk focused on North Korea winding down its weapons program in return for the US waiving some of the sanctions it had placed on Pyongyang. But 5 years later, that promise of fewer sanctions has not panned out, with Kim now supposedly believing that North Korea has 2 options when it comes to the US: live under the thumb of a supposed oppressor, or as DW puts it, take advantage of the supposed fact that the time is ripe for the status quo to be challenged. We can see this change of approach most clearly when we look beyond the US and check how Kim Jong-un is talking about his neighbor, South Korea. In the 2023 year-end speech that Kim gave to the North Korean people, he made several promises. Beyond outlining some of the country's military plans for 2024, he touched on inter-Korean relationships, and his tone was hostile. The conversation reports that Kim said that the relationship between the two has become a relationship between 2 hostile countries and 2 belligerents at war. The rhetoric became even more aggressive. Kim went on to say that he now believed the Republic of Korea clan to be Pyongyang's biggest enemy, calling for North Korea to continue stockpiling weapons to ensure it had the overwhelming power to defeat its southern nemesis. Forbes also has snippets of Kim's speeches in which he declares South Korea a hostile state, and most worryingly, that he would not hesitate to use nuclear weapons if, quote, the enemies ignite a war. Reuters also reported that Kim told his military that it needs to be ready to pacify the entire territory of South Korea, again mentioning the use of nuclear bombs as a response to any attack the South makes. Kim making threats to South Korea isn't anything new, but the nature of these threats, especially the reclassification of South Korea as a hostile state, is something that we've not seen before. Kim is following his normal route in propaganda terms of blaming enemies of North Korea for escalating conflict. But now he's saying that those supposed escalations will be met with force, all suggesting that he's gearing up for a war in 2024. But again, you could argue that those are just words, the ramblings of a madman whose bark is far worse than his bite. The real proof that North Korea will go to war in 2024 comes from Kim's actions rather than what he says in an attempt to ensure his oppressed people stay loyal to him and his causes. Kim's actions suggest that war is practically inevitable. For all of his posturing, giving up on the concept of reunification with South Korea means that Kim has said no to any potentially peaceful resolution of the conflict that exists between them. Instead, he's looking to claim South Korea through force, and what he's doing on the military front supports that claim. Take his new satellites and drones as an example. During the previously mentioned end-of-year speech, Kim Jong-un announced that North Korea will be launching 3 new satellites in 2024. The announcement comes in the wake of Pyongyang finally managing to get a spy satellite into space in November 2023, with that launch achieving success at the 3rd time of asking, following 2 failed launches. What this proves is that North Korea now has the technology to launch the satellites that Kim wants to build, and if he gets 3 more in orbit during 2024, Kim will have the ability to spy on South Korea and potentially the US in ways he hasn't been able to do before. The November launch was controversial enough. The US condemned it for being in brazen violation of UN resolutions intended to govern such launches, so Kim has shown that he doesn't care about following international laws and resolutions. Add to all of this Kim's promise to start building military drones. Again, Pyongyang could argue that this action is simply an attempt to achieve parity with the US and South Korea, both of which have access to drones. But when taken along with the rhetoric, remember, Kim is blaming provocation from the US and South Korea for these policies, the picture becomes clearer. Kim would have his people believe that the supposed provocations from North Korea's enemies are going to force his hand, with every move he makes from now until conflict begins merely being preparation so Pyongyang can defend itself. And there's much more. North Korea's missile tests have been intensifying over the last year, with the country also supposedly developing new types of missiles that would allow it to pose even a greater threat to its enemies. According to DW, 2023 saw Pyongyang launch a record number of missiles, a clear show of strength directed at South Korea, along with a rocket from November that put its satellite into space. Worse yet, Kim claims that one of the missiles it launched is an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile that would allow it to hit targets much further afield than any missile it used previously. ICBMs often carry nuclear warheads. Though North Korea's testing of this type of technology isn't confirmed, a successful ICBM test would mean that Kim has the missiles he needs to drop a nuke on South Korea without his army ever having to leave the North. That is a worrying prospect, and it feeds into the nuclear rhetoric that Kim's been spouting since the end of 2023. Just as worrying are the reports coming of the country's first missile test of 2024. On January 15th, CBS reported that North Korea claimed it had conducted its first successful flight test of a solid-fuel missile equipped with a hypersonic warhead. The launch was detected by both the Japanese and South Korean militaries, with the mention of a hypersonic warhead being especially troublesome. The Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation says that anything that can travel at hypersonic speeds is capable of Mach 5 or higher, at least 5 times the speed of sound. While ballistic missiles have long been capable of hitting these types of speeds, the fact that North Korea is apparently now capable of launching Mach 5 rockets is huge. After all, the faster a missile can move, the harder it is to both detect and hit it when it's in motion. Plus, faster rockets result in less time to shoot the missile out of the sky. Regardless, the missile traveled about 621 miles before landing in the East Sea, with Japan's defense ministry stating it had reached a maximum altitude of 30 miles. It's also not the first North Korean missile to splash down in the East Sea in recent times. A Hwasong-18 ICBM fired from Pyongyang did the same on December 18, 2023. All of this amounts to Kim Jong-un showing the world that North Korea has missiles that are capable of hitting South Korea. Those missiles may not have the precise capabilities that he claims. We can rarely tell between propaganda and truth when it comes to Kim's rhetoric. But Pyongyang's rockets clearly work well enough to launch satellites and reach some of Kim's most feared enemies. With capable missiles now a part of his military, Kim's able to back something up that he's offered many times in the past: his nuclear threats. Reuters reported that North Korea hasn't tested a nuclear weapon since 2017, the same year that it was able to successfully launch an ICBM. That successful test came with typical bluster from Kim Jong-un, who directed his threats at Japan by claiming that his new missiles could sink Japan into the sea. However, nothing came of these threats. That isn't because North Korea has abandoned its nuclear program. North Korea has abandoned its that Kim has likely been slowly building up his stockpile in the years that followed the successful 2017 test. It points to data from the Institute for Science and International Study, which says that Pyongyang may have had anywhere between 31 and 96 nukes in April 2023. It may have built more in the months since, and Kim hasn't been shy about his nuclear ambitions. In 2021, he claimed that North Korea had created technology that allows it to miniaturize and lighten its standard nuclear weapons, making them easier to launch, and potentially meaning Pyongyang's ICBMs could carry their nuclear payloads even further. Plus, January 2023 brought with it clear claims from Kim that he aimed to exponentially expand North Korea's nuclear arsenal, building up to it having the ability to mass-produce tactical warheads. All extremely worrying stuff. However, concern could evolve into fear when we consider the fact that nuclear terrorists on the Korean peninsula have worsened since the beginning of 2023. Back then, Kim's claims of expansion could have been seen as posturing, like so much of what he says. But the fact that he's directly mentioned that North Korea would respond to any aggression from South Korea with a nuclear strike. Every recent missile launch has been a threat of a nuclear strike. So too has every claim about the expansion and modernization of North Korea's nuclear arsenal. It all leads to a tense situation. And it's a situation that the United States may be unintentionally feeding. According to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, the U.S. is committed to using nuclear weapons in defense of South Korea should any country launch nukes against it. That was cause enough for tension on its own. You could argue that North Korea's entire nuclear program even emerged as a response to this indirect threat. And even though the U.S. would be unlikely to ever launch nukes unless it was a retaliatory strike, think of it as a self-fulfilling prophecy. North Korea is so threatened by the U.S. and its nukes that it developed nuclear weapons of its own, thus intensifying that threat. Tensions deepened even more when South Korea and the U.S. announced that they plan to cooperate to form a plan for nuclear weapons use. ICAN says that declaration came in April 2023, deepening the cooperation that already exists between the U.S. and South Korea as a part of their Indo-Pacific Trilateral Military Agreement, which also includes Japan, to cooperate militaristically. On the one hand, the agreement saw South Korea's president, Yoon Suk-yeol, reaffirm that his country wouldn't make any efforts to develop its own nuclear weapons despite international pressure to do so in the face of North Korea's threats. But it's also in this agreement that the U.S. confirmed that it would issue a swift, overwhelming, and decisive response to any nuclear launch by North Korea. Kim Jong-un likely took this as a direct threat. His increasingly aggressive rhetoric seems to suggest he did, along with his reframing of South Korea as a hostile nation, rather than one with which he aims to achieve reunification. Perhaps Kim sees the combined threat of South Korea and the U.S., with Japan backing them up, as so great that he'll have no choice but to push the nuclear button, regardless of what the U.S. claims it would do in response. There's also one little change in vernacular that could lend credence to the idea that Kim is more willing to use nuclear weapons. When Pyongyang launched its ICBM into the East Sea in December 2023, it called the test a launch drill. Every reference to similar launches in months and years prior have always been referred to as test firings. The switch to launch drill may seem minor, but it could confirm that Pyongyang has perfected its Hwasong-18 ICBM and is now ready to move into mass production rather than building individual rockets to see if they'll work. Only time will tell. But if we put it all together, the picture does not look pretty. Kim is making increasingly aggressive threats against his, quote, enemies, as well as putting his military on notice. He's made a direct reference to conducting nuclear strikes, with his missile tests proving he is likely capable of doing so. The launch of 3 new spy satellites in 2024 will enable him to conduct reconnaissance on South Korea in ways that he previously couldn't. Worse yet, there's more evidence that Kim is gearing up for something big. DW reports that U.S. satellites have recently tracked changes to a chemical production base called Manfo-Una Chemical Complex. The base, which is believed to be used to create the chemicals needed to fuel North Korea's missiles, as well as chemicals that go into its nuclear weapons, has been undergoing extensive expansion and modernization in recent years. 38 North has more news. It says that the satellite images, all of which come from commercial satellites, have shown increased activity at the plant since April 4, 2021, suggesting a ramping up of Kim's nuclear arsenal. This tallies with what Kim himself says, and with the Reuters article that claims that he may have nearly 100 nuclear weapons in his arsenal. The 38 North article goes on to say that the satellite imagery has tracked multiple instances of special rail cars moving between the Una base and North Korea's Yongbyon Nuclear Scientific Research Center, the place responsible for most of the country's nukes. Those rail cars are believed to carry chemical reagents, specifically nitric and sulfuric acid, that are used to convert, enrich, and process the materials used in nuclear bombs. In short, there's a clear link between a chemical plant that's being modernized and Pyongyang's chief nuclear research center. As for the modernization efforts, 38 North says that the facility now has 5 production plants, all stationed alongside a single specialized railway that runs through the facility and connects 2 others. Imagery captured in 2016 showed the implementation of several settling tanks for chemicals, though later images showed those tanks to be empty, raising questions about whether they're operational. However, most eyes should be focused on one of the facility's southern production plants. Made up of 2 large buildings, this plant has seen the addition of a pair of vertical storage tanks since 2018, along with consistent renovations and the building of the foundation of a new storage building, which looks likely to measure 12 by 90 meters. All of this activity tells us that the plant is up and running and that it's supplying chemicals to help the North Korean war effort. These are also not the only expansions occurring. On January 25th, 38 North also reported on the construction of a new wharf, this time at a petrochemical facility located in Nampo. That port is North Korea's largest, and it connects to the Taedong River to provide easy access to China and the rest of Southeast Asia. New storage tanks have been added, with 38 North suggesting that the work indicates that North Korea expects to start importing more petroleum, lubricants, and oils, all materials used in weapons, in the coming months. These are just 2 isolated examples of the modernization that appear to be happening in North Korea. Taken alone, they might mean little, but in the wake of Kim's nuclear threats, the expansion of the chemical plant that directly links Pyongyang's nuclear research takes on a whole new meaning. And building a new wharf in Nampo suggests that increased trade between North Korea and China is expected to take place. And that brings us to our ultimate sign that North Korea is gearing up for a war in 2024. It's strengthening its alliances. In December 2023, the South China Morning Post reported that a senior North Korean diplomat visited Beijing. The visit was notable because it was the first made to China since before the COVID-19 pandemic, with the media outlet reporting that the meeting could have been a way for China to sue North Korea as a way to put pressure on the US. That may have been the case, but it's also worth noting that the meeting could represent the defrosting of some tensions that have built between North Korea and China in recent years, especially given that China is now more open to deporting North Korean escapees. Plus, on January 25th, The Independent reported that North Korea was preparing to host a Chinese delegation led by China's vice foreign minister, again with the likely goal of strengthening bonds between Pyongyang and Beijing. An alliance like this could give Kim the confidence he needs to launch a strike against South Korea, especially if China offers its military backing. It's also not the only partnership North Korea is cultivating. On January 24th, VOA News reported that the alliance between North Korea and Russia was reaching previously unheard-of levels. It reported on Pranay Vadi, the Senior Director of Arms Control and Non-Proliferation at the National Security Council, who gave a chilling speech to the Center for Strategic and International Studies on January 18th. Vadi said, "What we are seeing between Russia and North Korea is an unprecedented level of cooperation in the military sphere. VOA's reports highlight that Putin turned to Kim when he needed to replenish Moscow's weapon stockpile after the Ukraine invasion took longer than Putin anticipated. Kim obliged, and in doing so, he built a bond with Russia that goes beyond mere trade. Satellite images released in October 2023 showed about 1,000 containers shipping from North Korea to Russia, all in violation of sanctions against Moscow, that likely contained weapons. The New York Times reported that North Korean artillery has started to show up in Ukraine, confirming the military alliance. Kim is helping Russia in this way because he knows he'll be able to go running to Putin when he decides to start his own war. He wants to see the situation in Ukraine resolved in Russia's favor, so that he'll have another major power in his corner when he eventually decides to attack. For as much as many analysts see Kim and perhaps even North Korea as a whole a big joke, it's clear that the great successor has been gearing up for something big. He's forging alliances with the world's two strongest military powers after the United States. He has nuclear weapons and has built the missiles to launch them. North Korea is engaging in the modernization and expansion of crucial bases, and it's now able to launch spy satellites into space. All of this has been achieved amidst recent rhetoric that shows that Kim Jong-un isn't in the mood for normalization or reunification anymore. He's ready for war, and at some point in 2024 he's going to have moved all of his chess pieces into place, meaning he'll be ready to strike. In 2017, 24-year-old Koo Jong-hwa accomplished something many of the 26 million people in North Korea have only dreamed of. She sneaked across the border into China, taking her son with her. Her happiness was short-lived. She was soon in handcuffs, weeping, envisioning barbaric torture and her untimely death. The question is, what would make a mother so desperate to compel her to risk obscene punishment and execution of her and her son, who, by the way, was suffering from severe frostbite? This will now explain and tell you what happened to Koo Jong-hwa and her son later. To an outsider looking in, you could sometimes be forgiven for thinking that life in North Korea isn't all that bad. Children go to school, folks go ice skating on the weekend, they cheer at soccer matches and make snowmen in the winter. But when you peel back some layers of this mysterious rotten onion of a country, your eyes will tear with incomprehension and grief. North Korea is a country with many faces. For the outside visitors that experience it, they see a carefully orchestrated version of the country, not the grim reality. They hear nothing about how people working in Pyongyang's cushy government jobs barely get by on their $4 a month wage, or factory workers getting solitary dollars per month. Some get 50 cents. They certainly don't see the hungry masses out in the provinces who are at risk of starvation and freezing to death during North Korea's incredibly bleak winters. People who work on the land of which only 20% is arable. These people are told daily they live in the best country in the world. First and foremost in the daily life of a North Korean is a large dose of propaganda. The enemy is always a threat, they're told, intent on wrecking the great life that they have. Japan, the United States of America, and the Republic of Korea all want them dead. This is a constant message in all media. The so-called eternal leaders of Korea are everywhere people look. Every day is a reminder that they should be grateful they have such a literally supreme guy in charge, a man from a family almost touched by gods. The people of North Korea start being fed propaganda from a very young age. All children should go to kindergarten and then to a primary school called People's School, where they stay from 6 years to the age of 9. They study in a secondary school until they're 16 and then possibly go to a university. Some do, but most just join the military. All education is state-funded. If you can say something positive about North Korean education standards, it's that according to UNESCO, the country has a 98 to 100% literacy rate. You kind of need that though when propaganda is being shoved down your throat all your life. Some lucky students might go on to study at the prestigious Kim Il-sung University, but only if they've excelled during their previous studies. Others go to one of the thousands of vocation schools, and many of those who excel in science or mathematics often end up at the University of National Defense, where one day they might find themselves becoming a leader in hypersonic missile technology. In 2021, a new part of the university was opened, a special department of hypersonic missiles. This is what many students aspire to do. You might be wondering how this is all possible when North Korea conscripts its young into military service. It is true, at 17, men must begin 10 years military service. Women may also serve, but only until they're 23. In both cases, there is a selection process, and the most academically gifted kids can ignore the military entirely, as can the kids of the elites who are born into high status. Something very important in North Korea is songbun. This is a status system in which certain acts gain people social credit. Good songbun means more choices are available to people. On the other hand, if someone's related to a defector, their score will likely be low and their options dire. North Korea states that all students must acquire the concept of revolution and endless loyalty toward the party and the supreme leader. All education is based on the revolutionary ideal. Every day that a kid goes to elementary school, he's learning the idolization of the supreme leader. When he gets home, the TV shows him how he can be a good revolutionary. Regularly, the TV explains how to accrue better social credit. Not long ago, a woman was roundly chastised by the Korean media for saving her kid in a house fire and not saving the pictures of the leaders on her kitchen wall. North Korea media applauded the neighbor who ran into the house to save the pictures. That's how you get some good songbun. The state security department uses various surveillance systems to keep an eye on people. The secret police is everywhere. People never know if their neighbors will snitch on them. This not knowing who to trust creates an atmosphere of intense fear, which, as you'll see today, has wide-ranging negative effects on mental health. It was recently reported that over 200 executions happened throughout the country, with teenagers expected to watch in many instances. Some teens were executed just for having a USB stick containing K-pop and South Korean soap operas. In one case, the kid was wheeled out into a stadium and shot 9 times as his school buddies watched from the seats. They were expected to clap, even though some kids were close to tears. Another report says someone had a slip of the tongue and criticized the government. Such cases do not reach Amnesty International. They happen behind closed doors. Like in medieval Europe, often the bodies are left to rot where they fall, a reminder to the public of what could happen to them. A defector named Ose Haik explained, "They hanged people in crowded places like markets and left the bodies there for hours to instill fear among the people." Another defector in the same report was just 7 years old. In painting class in South Korea, he surprised his teacher when he sketched a scene of a firing squad in the countryside killing locals in a field. This was his reality. So when we're talking about learning math in North Korea in school, it can sound normal, but we should not underestimate the distressing climate of fear these kids have to live through. Although to many this is what their normal day-to-day life is like, things are made worse because being a good snitch might mean the difference between starving to death in the next famine or being sent to the capital to work in relative comfort. In 2019, a cadre on state-sponsored TV announced that new rewards were available for snitching on people for engaging in illegal activities. They were told people who want to get the rewards can file reports, and the government can then eliminate people filled with discontent. The reward was $6. In North Korea, selling things on the black market, such as foreign entertainment or goods, is one of the only ways to make money. According to a North Korean source, most people didn't want the reward money. That would upset the black economy, the source explained. It did not work out well. The state can't even guarantee basic living conditions for the people, and the people can't make their own living without breaking the law, so why would anyone want to report on anyone else? He said these crackdowns happen ever so often when the government feels like it's losing its grip on the populace. In 2015, there was a similar snitch scheme. A source said the security services is cracking down hard on asylum seekers and smugglers, and it has promised incredible rewards to anyone who points to defectors or smugglers. Poor farmers, he said, were tempted. In 2021, someone snitched. It was reported that a villager and a soldier were shot in a field for the crime of disturbing entertainment, what leader Kim Jong-un had recently called a vicious cancer, trying to destroy the North Korean way of life. In one case, a large crowd congregates at the town square, and a young man is dragged out, accused of being found with, wait for it, a movie and 75 songs from South Korea. This is daily life in North Korea. A North Korean girl who escaped said she and her classmates were there when a kid was executed again for nothing but distributing entertainment. Like many North Koreans, she suffered from mental problems after seeing such savagery. She said, "The prisoner could hardly walk and had to be dragged out. I was so terrified that I could not dare to look at a soldier in uniform for 6 months afterward." It's not that North Koreans don't know anything about the West. They've been buying bootleg DVDs for years now. North Korean TV has innocently featured the Rocky theme tune, and Minnie and Mickey Mouse have appeared now and again. In 2018, prior to peace talks with the US breaking down, even South Korean K-pop stars were invited to Pyongyang. Kim clapped after some of the songs and asked questions about the lyrics, which was surprising to say the least. But that was just him playing the part of the benevolent leader, the good guy who now and again can relax. This comes straight out of a dictator's playbook. Every so often, they're supposed to show that they have mercy. Kim often pardons people from their death sentences, usually to great applause, just as happened in those bloody Roman arenas where the emperor spared a life because he thought it would get the populace on his side. When kids get older, they might go to university, but if they choose a humanities subject, it's still based on the ideology of the party. The word for this ever-present ideology is Juche. For instance, some philosophy courses are philosophy of the Juche ideology, or Juche political economy. It's brainwashing. You can be sure they aren't learning about anarchy, skepticism, and even the wonders of liberal democracy. Capitalism is evil, say the men teaching them as they drive home in their imported luxury cars. Ironically, the North Korean Constitution under Articles 64 and 65 guarantees democratic rights and freedoms for all citizens in all spheres of state and social life. That's what they call Orwellian doublespeak. North Korea is totalitarianism. Its mission is to carry out the military first revolution line in order to protect the nerve center of the revolution. Students can't question this. Academic courses are full of lies. Students can read that their supreme leader Kim Jong-il fired off a round of golf and after 11 holes in one got a 38 under par. This was on a professional course by a man who never swung a golf club. The students know it's impossible, but they can't question it. Some know it's not true that one of their leaders invented the hamburger, but they can't disagree nonetheless. Students who study medicine might question if it's true that North Korean scientists cured HIV and AIDS and Ebola. They just can't say that. North Koreans learn Korean nationalism, which has little or nothing to do with the Marxist communism and ideas about widespread well-being. They hear how their people are racially pure, that mankind itself started in North Korea, where the first humans arose. They're told that their purity is always in battle with the imperialist, capitalist foreign powers. The divine, they're told, can only be found in the Kims. Like European kings and queens in the times past, North Koreans are told the Kims rule by divine right. In 1992, American evangelist Billy Graham visited North Korea and spent time with their then leader Kim Il-sung. North Koreans learned how this Christian man was highly impressed by Kim. These days, they can read in books and newspapers that Graham said, "Having observed the supreme leader Kim Il-sung's unique political leadership, I can only think that he is God." The texts then say Graham looked at Kim and announced, "Kim is this world's God. Why would a country like this need the Holy Bible?" North Koreans aren't religious, but the Kims are portrayed as a kind of holy incarnation born to rule. If Billy Graham said so, it must be true. Imagine if the people knew their present leader likes to play World of Tanks online and occasionally watch Western pornography. Some of North Korea's best students become scientists. So you might wonder how they do their job, knowing many things they've been told are a lie. After all, science shouldn't lie. To get better at it, to improve something, you have to work with scientific facts. This is why the best scientists work behind great big, guarded walls. One of them, Kim Hyung-soo, said before he defected he worked in a lab trying to better understand diseases such as the hardening of the arteries. Everything he did was in secret. What he discovered was only heard by the party bosses. Hyun-soo once told the press that he had a colleague with a PhD in medicine who told his close buddies what he did. He was subsequently arrested as a political prisoner, as was his entire family. Knowledge is dangerous in North Korea. Talking about the general state of research, he said, "Scientists don't believe what the propaganda feeds them, but they cannot discredit it either. You have to think what the party tells you to think." Most people, though, don't work in science. The average Joe works 6 days a week in a factory or on a farm. Article 22 of the labor law says they should work 8 hours a day. They should also get national holidays, off days, and have enough rest time. Like you, they might eat 3 times a day. Breakfast might consist of rice and soup, possibly with some side dishes. The richer you are, the more you get. People often take a lunchbox to work with them, which again will feature rice and side dishes. Dinner is more rice, soup, and again, side dishes. People near the coast might get seafood. The more money you have, the more meat you can buy. Farmers tend to eat vegetables and herbs that they've collected themselves. A former North Korean soldier explained his rations, saying, "I still cannot forget North Korean army food. The standard meal was a bowl of 30% white rice and 70% cornmeal, 1 bowl of lettuce, and soybean paste soup. This was served with salted radish, soybean fried radish, and cabbage kimchi. Soldiers had this every day, but special food was given for their birthdays and national holidays." All defectors say the same thing. You need to make money on the black market to feed yourself well. The government's rice rations are not enough. One really cheap thing is smoking. North Korean cigarettes could be as cheap as 8 cents a pack. The standard price is 17 to 32 cents a pack. Almost half of the males in North Korea smoke, but very few females do, maybe only about 3%. It's also a heavy drinking country. with people preferring hard liquor, often bought at the market under the table. The reason for all the boozing, of course, is stress. As a German doctor and activist once said, there's a lot of alcoholism. It's the only pleasure they have. Fear creates sickness. I saw many victims of alcoholism in the hospital. It's common for people to buy their booze straight from the factory. If they can afford it, they get the Chinese stuff. One of the most popular drinks is Kaoliang liquor from China, which can be between 38 and 63% alcohol by volume. Very strong. Many North Koreans can't afford that, so people brew their own stuff, even though it's illegal. The government doesn't see this as the same kind of risk as listening to K-pop, so most officials turn a blind eye to people making their own hooch. One guy explained, "In my town, 1 out of every 10 households made alcohol at home. The most widely used ingredients were potatoes and corn." He said beer was seen as a soft drink that kids would regularly drink. There was an age limit of 18 for booze, but he said no one gave a damn about it. Again, this shows how lax North Korean rules can be for some things. You can destroy your liver or smoke until you speak out of a hole in your throat, but for God's sake, whatever you do, don't you dare listen to the latest BTS song. Folks like to drink with their buddies after they've just had to watch mind-numbing state-controlled television programs on TV. They might have to sing revolutionary songs in public and look like they mean it, but that doesn't mean they won't be laughing about that later over a glass of hooch. People do see through all the lies there, some people. It's just very dangerous to speak about it. One defector said this: while the North Korean government wanted people to see their lovers as fellow revolutionary comrades, the truth was that this feeling never truly existed for many of us. We pretended to have that quality only because we were forced to. He learned about the supreme leader in high school, but said he and his friends sometimes ignored all that and had fun. He and his buddies used to drink together, they used to date girls, but since dating was not allowed in school, the couples would sneak off to one of the parents' apartments that they knew was empty. Much of the entertainment made in North Korea was just more propaganda. There used to be a long-running comedy show called It's So Funny, which sounds like the least funny thing you've ever seen in your life. This is some actual dialogue from one of the episodes. This man and woman are talking about how great beans are. Man, if we soldiers see beans, we become happy. He starts laughing out loud. Woman, if we farm in the way General tells us, we will become happy. They both laugh together, slapping each other on the back. That's the whole joke. Presumably, the viewers at home are also in hysterics. That, or they were busy trying to choke themselves with their own fists while frantically looking for the booze. When a defector was asked about the show, he said, "The show is delivering the same material over and over again. They're still talking about beans. The country hasn't changed at all since I defected about 20 years ago." One thing you definitely don't get are documentaries detailing how many North Koreans in the far-off provinces are living on the brink of starvation or being worked to death in labor camps. This brings us to the matter of crime. If you can be executed for watching a South Korean soap opera, it can be expected that other kinds of crimes will also lead to severe punishments. North Korea has the same criminals as everywhere else on the planet. However, the highly corrupt government tries to portray the country as crime-free, unlike America, where it says society has become decadent, depraved, and divided. North Koreans steal. They kill each other in arguments. They work so damn hard in the countryside that they take methamphetamine when they can get their hands on it. Ordinary crimes like these are called kyowaso. If it's perceived that a person has engaged in anti-socialist activities, they might be exiled. If they have property, it'll be confiscated, as will their worldly goods. Exiles have their ration cards taken away and they lose all their citizen rights. They'll usually end up working on a farm or doing something like building roads. The people who have it worse are the 150,000 to 200,000 serving 5 to 20 years in a labor camp. The UN says about 40% of the prisoners in labor camps die from malnutrition. They're fed very little and often have to do grueling work, such as mining. Some of these prisoners are not being re-educated. The government has classified them as unredeemable. After a hard day's work on a farm or in a mine, starting at 5 a.m. and finishing at night, they're often given a small portion of cabbage or corn. Many prisoners look for insects or vermin, a good source of protein. Some former prisoners have said people have eaten grass mixed with cow poo. There are even reports of cannibalism happening in the camps. A defector who now lives in the U.S. after defecting said he was born and brought up in a labor camp. His name is Shin Dong-hyuk. In the camp, he knew nothing, not the existence of the USA or other countries, and certainly not that the world was a sphere. All he knew was pain and hunger. When asked if he loved his parents in the camp, he said he had no concept of love. He explained that once a girl stole some corn and was beaten to death for it in front of him. He said he felt nothing. He was a child of the camp. This was normal life for him. He went on to say if you escape, you would be shot. If you try to escape or plan to escape, you would be shot. Even if you did not report someone who is trying to escape, you would be shot. One time they dragged him and his family to the front when it was announced another execution was imminent. Since he was at the front, he thought it might be him. It wasn't, it was his mother and brother. Was he sad? No. He didn't know what love was. He said at the time he thought that they got what they deserved for breaking the prison rules. The rules were clear to everyone. They were stapled to the walls. Try to escape? Death. Steal? Death. Talk in a group of more than 3 people? Death. Rebel against a guard? Death. Don't report suspicious activity? Death. Don't admit you're wrong? Death. As for a minor transgression, Shin Dong-hyuk explained that once he annoyed a guard when he was still young, and the guard decided just to cut off his finger. He added, "I was taken to the clinic and given medical attention, but without any anesthesia whatsoever." The guards wanted the men and women to have relationships. The more kids in the camp, the more labor available. But the guards often didn't let people wait to meet someone they liked. Matchmaking would go like this. Guard, you two, you've been matched. From today on, you're married, work hard, and don't waste your time. If you slack, I'll split you up. Shin Dong-hyuk said for most people, resistance is simply unthinkable. He took the risk of his life and escaped. And now he's trying to make sense of that deep heart of darkness where he once lived. In less severe cases, let's say someone shirked at work or maybe they were found to keep a messy kitchen, they might face public ostracism. That'll consist of being ignored by colleagues. Your neighbors will tut when you walk past them. All of this causes severe stress. People feel the weight of their oppression at all times. Not only do many people smoke and drink a lot, but these days they're on drugs. In 2019, news reports said that during the Lunar New Year, one of the main gifts people exchanged was methamphetamine. It had seeped out of the countryside and into the cities. As with everything in North Korea, dealers were able to bribe officials, and so the stuff was being exchanged openly and very liberally. Drug dealing is also a great way to make money in a country where making a buck isn't easy at all. Psychiatrists that have helped defectors once they got to South Korea said they found many people suffered from a whole host of mental problems. In a research paper, it said many of them were still totally focused on survival amid continuity of intense suffering, even though they were now free. In short, they were traumatized. A separate study found that the cause of their trauma was witnessing government executions, enduring starvation, starvation-related deaths of family and friends, witnessing extreme physical assaults. Now there's a catch-22 in North Korea. People feel crazy with all that stress, but if they admit they're even depressed, it can be classified as anti-socialist behavior. If they say that they're happy even though they aren't, they're being good citizens. That's the reason a report stated anxiety disorders and depression seem to receive no specialized psychiatric treatment in North Korea. If patients are worse, perhaps psychotic or just maniacally screaming how bad things are, they're packed off to special number 49 hospitals. They receive zero counseling and psychotherapy and instead are given intravenous insulin that renders them comatose. Life gets much worse when there are droughts or floods or any number of natural disasters. The World Food Program has said that North Korean government used to give 400 grams of food daily per person, but in 2019, because of crop shortages, that went down to 300 grams per person per day. The UN says survival rations should be 600 grams daily per person. A nurse that defected in 2013 talked about the lack of sustenance, saying, "Since there isn't anything to eat in North Korea, we eat everything we can get. We eat roots and anything that is chewable." She added there was a mother who entrusted the nursery with her 3 kids, but all 3 starved to death. Out in the countryside, it's doubtful there will ever be power to heat huts and ramshackle houses when the temperatures sometimes go down to -13 degrees Celsius. They use wood or coal, but that's not always available. Meanwhile, elites are warm and cozy in their state-sponsored harems, women who've been taught to make a man happy in various ways. These are sometimes referred to as pleasure squads, or in Korean, kipomjo. But they are only for the 2,000 or so top officials who also enjoy luxury goods from the West, such as cigars, perfume, or the Rolls-Royce and Mercedes-Benzes that they often drive around in. These top dogs own mansions and palaces and have bank accounts in countries all over the world. Kim Jong-il himself is said to be worth $5 billion. He's reported to have over 100 luxury cars, a private jet, and a luxury yacht. Now you can understand why he has people executed for contacting the outside world. His propaganda is not a noble lie, it's plain old greed. And those at the top use the fear of the so-called imperialists so they can maintain their exquisite status. This is the absolute opposite of social happiness, but all totalitarian governments work under the principle that they are doing everything for the common good. The retirement age in North Korea is 60 for men and 55 for women, upon which they're supposed to receive 30% of their last salary plus 300 grams of food. Many will sell things at the market despite it being illegal, so they can try to get enough money for snacks or possibly drinking at friends' houses. The women, according to one defector, prefer to spend their time practicing such things as embroidery or handicrafts. Still, North Korea's social security system is not stable, so most old folks work. Teachers do private classes, some people mend shoes or umbrellas, others will walk around the streets charging close to nothing to refill people's overworked cigarette lighters. As always, the people with any power, the cadres, can always make extra cash from being paid bribes. A retired policeman might tell a young cop to turn a blind eye to that guy selling DVDs. In North Korea, most of the money that changes hands is black market money. Very few poor people in the capital will ever head to the glittering places such as the Potonggang department store to buy their goods. Western journalists will often say barely anyone in North Korea can go there for things like the Heinz ketchup and the foreign clothes. They say the place was only created to show Western tourists and journalists how North Korea is no longer a place of abject poverty. Ji Sung-lee, who defected a long time ago, said she was never fooled. Sure, she hated the Japanese due to the historical reasons, but didn't hate Americans as she was told to. She remembers when she was young, she was told that during the Korean War, American soldiers tore the limbs off of innocent Korean civilians. Her young mind heard how these soldiers gouged out people's eyes, sliced off their lips, and then hung them from trees as they would decorate a Christmas tree at home. But then she decided to ask the older people in her village about this. She said, "They told us a different story. They said American soldiers adored Korean children and showered them with chocolate and gum." Like everyone in North Korea, by law, she had to stay in her province. She had to listen as the local government pumped out propaganda about their glorious leader, and TV every day had its 2 minutes of hate aimed at the evil imperialists. But now she's a woman of the world, and it's no longer a crime for her to wear the wrong facial expression in public or to think the wrong thoughts. She's learned that there's good and bad everywhere, but not all Americans give candy to kids. Some committed war crimes in Korea. That's true, but now she can talk about it freely, just as she could say what she wants about North Korea. As for poor Koo Jong-hwa, who we talked about in the intro, she was not so lucky. Amnesty says after she was caught, her son recovered from his frostbite and was sent to live with his grandmother. Her husband, who was in South Korea, said the one good thing is, for some reason, Koo Jong-hwa didn't end up in a labor camp. The reason we expect is the fact that Amnesty published the case. She might not be imprisoned, but her bad songbun probably hasn't done her any favors. The other 8 escapees that were arrested and sent back were not published by names, and their whereabouts are unknown. There's a good chance crowds gathered for their execution. The children covered their eyes, the guns sounded, and the blood leaked from their bodies. Then everyone got back to work as if nothing happened. 1 week before launch. Tensions between North and South Korea are at an all-time high. The cooperation between both nations, which was meant to foster closer cooperation and hopefully lead to peaceful reconciliation, has turned sour, and the mutual economic and industrial zones built across the border from each other have been vacated for months. The new South Korean president is taking a much more hawkish stand on North Korea. Inspired by America's strategy in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, he's launched a military buildup over the last 2 years in office, forcing the North to try to keep up. With a much weaker economy, the North is falling behind as South Korea adds hundreds of new modern tanks, aircraft, armored vehicles, and self-propelled artillery to its forces every year. So far, North Korea has enjoyed a significant advantage in artillery over the South, with thousands of long and short-range batteries aimed across the DMZ. Much of this artillery can even reach Seoul, which is only 50 kilometers away from the shared border. The city has, in effect, been held hostage for decades by overwhelming North Korean firepower, with the South knowing that in case of hostilities, the city will come under an incredible barrage of thousands of rounds a minute. Hardened shelters have been built across the city, and public safety drills are a regular part of life for those living in Seoul. However, South Korea's rapid technological advancement and the addition of so much modern military hardware has started to erode the North's advantage. Now, advanced attack aircraft and counter-battery artillery can strike at North Korean guns with pinpoint precision and quickly eradicate them. Seoul won't get off scot-free, but the city also won't burn to the ground as many predicted before South Korea's modernization efforts. The Kim family feels it's running out of leverage over the South, and secretly it's being egged on by China to take action. Any attack on the South will prompt a U.S. response, as South Korea's ally is treaty-bound to defend the small nation. If the U.S. becomes embroiled in a new Korean conflict, it could create the opening China has been looking for to cross the Taiwan Strait and take the rebel province by force. Publicly, both the U.S. and China work to diffuse tensions. But in private, Chinese President Xi Jinping whispers poisonous words into Kim Jong-un's ear. What China can't imagine, though, is just how far the desperate North Korean leader is ready to push things. 2 days before launch. A pair of speedboats approaches a South Korean fishing vessel 100 miles off the coast of Incheon. At the same time, a midget submarine surfaces next to another fishing vessel off the coast of Busan. More midget submarines and speedboats approach fishing vessels off the coasts of Donghae, Masan, and Gunsan. The South Korean crews are startled by the appearance of North Korean Special Forces soldiers who demand their surrender. The civilian crews comply, the North Korean operatives working quickly to avoid anyone sending out radio distress calls. Once the crews have been subdued, they are executed and their bodies are tossed overboard. Each team unloads a large oval-shaped container from their respective midget submarine or speedboat and transfers it over to the seized vessel. 12 hours before launch, public health officials in protective gear begin spraying down local train stations in Jeonju, Daejeon, Sejong, Wonju, Seoul, and Daegu, and other major metropolitan cities across South Korea. The men work quickly in the pre-dawn hours and spray what appears to be disinfectant. A police cruiser in Daejeon stumbles across the work and approaches the man, signaling at a distance for them to stop briefly. The workers comply and, keeping a safe distance from the officers, explain they're spraying disinfectant in anticipation of a fresh COVID outbreak. The police patrol radios back to dispatch, but nobody seems to know the city's plans to spray local stations. But the officers write it off as yet another in a long list of miscommunications between City Hall and its police forces. Wishing them a good morning, the cruiser takes off as the senior patrolman makes a note about stopping for masks at a local pharmacy to take home with him after a shift. The last thing his family or South Korea needs is yet another COVID outbreak. 11 hours before launch, a city sanitation service van pulls up to the front gate of Camp Carroll just outside of Daegu. 2 guards work the gate, a young American fresh from the States and a Korean military policeman, part of a small detachment of Korean augmentation to the U.S. Army, or CAT USA. The Korean soldier and the city workers begin to talk in Korean, and the conversation gradually grows more agitated. The city workers are here to disinfect some of the public facilities on the small U.S. Army base and have credentials. But when the soldiers radio for verification, their security control has no record of any such work order. The conversation grows more heated, and the South Korean soldier starts to notice the city workers are becoming very uncomfortable. Acting on instinct, he pulls his 9mm service pistol out and demands the men step out of the van. Inside the van, the driver suddenly reaches for his own hidden pistol, but the American gate guard opens up with his M4 rifle. The 5.56mm rounds punch through the thin skin of the van and kill all 4 of the city workers. 9 hours before launch, the dead sanitation workers are not carrying any identification other than the credentials they first offered upon arriving at the gate. The credentials are authentic, but the identity of the individuals is not. The entire main gate is quarantined, and a U.S. Army hazardous materials team inspects it carefully, verifying that the contents of the large backpack sanitation spray are not, in fact, sanitizer. What it is remains unknown, but an emergency alert is dispatched across the entire joint American and South Korean military alerting system. 8 hours and 35 minutes before launch, the police patrol who stumbled across the city workers in Daejeon reports their encounter, setting off alarm bells across the South Korean government. Alarm grows into panic as similar reports come in from across the country. An emergency order to shut down South Korea's sprawling public transportation network is set out, and trains automatically come to a screeching halt. However, millions of South Koreans have already begun their workday after riding into the cities on public trains from suburbs across the nation. 6 hours before launch, the hijacked fishing vessels, now operated by North Korean Special Forces operatives in disguise as fishermen, slowly putter into their respective ports and take up berths. 4 hours before launch, in North Korea, a Kim Jong-un body double addresses the nation with a stirring speech full of the typical propaganda and threats the world has come to expect, and only grown in intensity over the last few months. A small crowd of a few hundred eagerly clap at their dear leader's speech in a public square in Pyongyang. American, Japanese, and South Korean intelligence analysts all watched the speech via hijacked connections to the closed North Korean media network. Each nation's spy agencies employ a mix of psychologists, body language experts, and even professional acting teachers to tease out any and all possible information from the weekly speeches. The fake Kim Jong-un's every single gesture and word is carefully dissected by these specialized teams, looking for any telltale physiological or psychological signs of stress or deception, which could signal an imminent threat from the North. South Korean artificial intelligence programs compare the live feed in real time to thousands of photographs and clips of Kim Jong-un stored in their databases. The AI makes a worrying conclusion. There's a 24.7% chance this is not, in fact, the real Kim Jong-un. 3 hours before launch, across every major city in the country and in some Korean and joint American bases, people are starting to feel ill. Emergency services are overwhelmed with reports of tens of thousands of cases of severe diarrhea and vomiting. 2 hours and 15 minutes before launch, The severely sick continue to grow by the hour, and a pattern quickly emerges. All who are affected have used public transportation that morning. Hospitals are completely overwhelmed, and military bases across the country work to isolate the infected quickly to begin an attempt to limit the spread to healthy military personnel. The United States of America enacts Defense Condition 3 across all of its installations in the South Pacific. Medical personnel and military biological chemical warfare specialists race to attempt to discover if the cause is chemical or biological, and if there is risk of spread after initial contamination. South Korean cities grind to a halt as millions of people are ordered to remain either in their homes or in workplaces, with any who exit threatened with immediate arrest. Panic spreads across the country. The American and South Korean Air Forces deploy deterrent armed combat air patrols over South Korea's east and west coast, as well as the DMZ. While at the DMZ itself, American and Korean soldiers move to their highest possible readiness 2 hours before launch. The imposter South Korean fishermen abandon their vessels. The North Korean operators, however, quickly run into a problem. National orders to remain indoors means that police patrols are out in force, and the men are unable to reach their respective safe houses. The teams try anyways, quickly drawing the attention of either police or civilians who promptly notify the police. Firefights between the North Korean Special Forces operators and local police ensue, but in the chaos of a possible nationwide biological or chemical attack, the reports never make it to the president's office in time. 5 minutes before launch. Tens of thousands of kilometers above the Earth, drifting in geosynchronous orbit, the U.S. Space Force's SBIRS High Geo 1 stares down at the planet with an unblinking electronic eye. The satellite is part of the space-based infrared system, an early warning system designed to detect everything from nuclear explosions to missile launches. The true capabilities of the entire American space surveillance system are classified, but it's known that it was able to detect the launch of anti-ship missiles by Houthi rebels in recent conflicts. During Desert Storm, it was vital for providing early warning of Iraqi Scud missile launches. The unblinking electronic eye registers a sudden massive heat plume on the southern tip of the Korean peninsula, then another, then 3 more after that. But it already has transmitted an automated message via the US's very high-frequency space communication network, and even as the 3rd massive heat plume is detected, the warning has reached the 2nd Space Warning Squadron, headquartered at Buckley Space Force Base in Colorado. A few nanoseconds later, the warning has reached both North American Aerospace Defense Command and United States Strategic Command, deep inside the bowels of Cheyenne Mountain Space Force Station. Down on Earth, Space Force personnel scramble to authenticate the warnings and within seconds receive confirmation. 5 nuclear detonations on the Korean peninsula, 1 at each of South Korea's 5 biggest port facilities. Supercomputers process all incoming information from precise heat measurement to height and width of debris cloud to estimate the yield, 25 kilotons. The information is already on its way to the White House via Link 16 communication system and fiber optic cables buried deep under the Earth. 3 minutes after what is now being called Event 1, the President of the United States of America is being hurried out of a meeting and into a nearby office, its occupant forced to vacate it immediately. A U.S. Air Force aide explains the situation to him as the nuclear football is set on the desk beside him. Launch. A mobile erector launcher backs out of a long mountain tunnel. The green military vehicle is a quarter length of a football field, and sitting atop its long trailer is a ballistic missile that only takes up about half of that length. The vehicle and its payload, like half a dozen others, has been hidden inside mountain tunnels for years in order to evade American spy satellites. Its 5 other partners are located across the heart of mountainous North Korea, but they carry much larger missiles. Their missiles are large enough to reach Hawaii and just past the American west coast. For now, they remain hidden, but they can be prepared for launch within 30 minutes' notice. Once clear of the tunnel entrance, a warning klaxon sounds from the vehicle as it moves its massive trailer into the ready launch position. The short-range ballistic missile is still massive, about 10 meters long and full of highly reactive fuel. The vehicle's crew shelters inside the crew cabin, while the outside technicians monitor the erector launcher from a distance. Lifting the missile into place can be dangerous as the big rocket is slowly swung upward and made vertical. Any flaw in manufacturing could lead to structural damage, a punctured fuel tank, and an extremely hazardous fuel leak. The hydrazine is extremely toxic and an explosion hazard from the slightest spark caused by bad wiring. With a sigh of relief by all gathered, the missile finally settles into place in its vertical position. Technicians run a quick set of diagnostics and receive the ready-go responses in return. The missile and its payload are prepared to fire. There is no countdown. The vehicle crew simply retreats back to the safety of the armored cab and the ground technicians behind blast shields located inside the tunnel. The launch is already behind schedule. The atomic detonations in South Korea's 5 largest harbors was supposed to coincide with the detonation of this short-range missile. Now the South Koreans and their American allies have advanced warning, and the mission's success is seriously jeopardized. That doesn't stop the massive North Korean war machine, however. Already artillery are laying waste to South Korean fortifications along the DMZ and blasting open a path through mine-infested ground for armored forces. The 100-kiloton warhead was meant to signal the renewing of hostilities and act as a deterrent to U.S. involvement. Now it'll have to play catch-up and hopefully evade the South's missile defenses. With a swoosh and then a mighty roar, the rocket engine powering the big missile comes to life. Clamps are released as the missile slowly lifts into the air. As hundreds of kilograms of fuel are burned in a second, the missile becomes considerably lighter, allowing it to pick up even more speed. Just 20 seconds after launch, the missile is already supersonic. 21 seconds after launch, SBIRS HiGeo-1 sends a new alert to the 2nd Space Warning Squadron. Its artificial intelligence confirms the heat signatures recorded in a remote patch of North Korean mountains as matching that of a short-range ballistic missile. The warning is relayed at light speed via the U.S. military's Very High-Frequency Satellite Communication System. Both an AWACS already put into the air out of precaution and ground-based air defense radars confirm the contact a few seconds later as the missile accelerates into the upper atmosphere and turns into a ballistic trajectory straight toward South Korea. Flying over 6 times the speed of sound in the very thin air of the upper atmosphere, there's no time for orders from the White House or anywhere else. Even if a state of war had not already existed between the North and South, American and Korean air defense networks operate on their own initiative to prosecute this threat. Outside of Lot Sky Hill Seongju Country Club, an American-operated terminal high-altitude area defense battery is already at work. Its powerful AN/TPY-2 radar is locked onto the North Korean missile and processing a firing solution for the 48 interceptors assigned to the battery. In seconds, 2 of the interceptors are fired. While that is designed to knock out much higher-flying ballistic missile threats, this one is well within engagement parameters. Normally, a ballistic missile would fly out into space before re-entering the Earth, but the short-range attack and an attempt to evade American missile defenses kept this missile inside of the atmosphere. The battery commander holds his breath as he watches the 2 merging radar tracks and continuously reminds his radar technician to be on the lookout for further threats or warning from the Space Force of new threats. He hasn't heard about the nuclear detonations across South Korea's ports yet and has no idea if this is a single launch or just the start of a nuclear bombardment. With as many as 50 nuclear weapons, North Korea could launch volleys of 3 dozen at a time if it wanted in an attempt to overwhelm the South's defenses. The radar tracks the interceptors and missiles as they close in on each other at hypersonic speeds. The hit-to-kill warheads separate from the rocket bodies and lock on to the incoming North Korean nuclear warhead, utilizing their infrared seeker heads and radar guidance via active link. The North Korean warhead, also free of its rocket body, is glowing red-hot on the infrared due to increasing friction with the air as it plunges down into the thicker atmosphere, making it an easy target to track. The battery commander breathes a sigh of relief that the North Korean missile did not deploy countermeasures. He would never admit this to the press or any civilians, but THAAD has a mixed history of success in realistic scenarios. So does America's Homeland ground-based interceptor system and pretty much any other ballistic missile defense program in the world. When you're trying to knock one bullet out of the sky with another bullet, there's a lot of room for errors. But not today. The first interceptor miraculously smashes into the North Korean warhead with enough kinetic energy to turn both projectiles into plasma briefly. There's no nuclear detonation, as the nuclear warhead requires a very specific chain of events to occur in order to properly detonate. All that's left of the North Korean threat is an expanding cloud of hypersonic debris raining down somewhere just north of Seoul. The battery commander immediately gets on the line with America's South Korean military command, who relays the news of the successful intercept to their South Korean allies, most of which already know, as they too were tracking the threat and interception. The nearly $1 billion system has proved its worth and prevented the deaths of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. Everyone assembled breathes a sigh of relief, but maintain their vigilance on the lookout for further threats. 1.5 hours after launch, a coordinated time-on-target attack by American standoff attack weapons rains down over Pyongyang and other government sites across North Korea. Launched via F-15s and F-35s, Slammer missiles, or Standoff Land Attack Missile Expanded Response, arrive at their targets within seconds of each other, delivering 500-pound warheads with pinpoint accuracy. Explosions rock Pyongyang as slams strike government buildings. Outside of the city, specially modified deep-penetrating missiles bury themselves into the ground before detonating. Their specialized warheads create shockwaves that cause deeply buried bunkers to collapse in on themselves. With their ability to reach out beyond the horizon, nowhere in North Korea is safe, and the U.S. Air Force strikes every single known or suspected hideout or bunker which is or could be housing Kim Jong-un. The Kim Jong-un double, sitting haplessly at the Rongsong residence, the presidential palace of North Korea, is atomized as half a dozen slams level the entire complex. Hot on the heels of the advanced American missiles as a combined South Korean and American air assault force, these Special Forces operators have one job: hunt down and kill the North Korean leader. Both nations have pooled their resources and intelligence over the years to root out every possible location Kim Jong-un could flee to in case of war, and are part of a decapitation strike meant to quickly end hostilities by terminating the supreme leader. The hope is that with the Kim regime annihilated, other North Korean politicians more interested in saving their own lives will negotiate with the South to cease hostilities. Simultaneously, a separate group of American and South Korean Special Forces and air assault troops fly at treetop height toward known North Korean nuclear sites. Unbeknownst to them, however, Chinese air assault troops are also doing this same thing from their own border. China cannot allow North Korea to freely use its nuclear weapons any more than America can, and despite the entire crisis making for good cover, the last thing President Xi Jinping wants is a nuclear war in his backyard. The American and South Korean forces find themselves engaging in firefights against North Korean defenders and the Chinese air assault troops, unaware of China's true intentions. A three-way chaos ensues with heavy casualties on both sides as known North Korean nuclear sites come under the control of either the South Korean-American alliance or the Chinese. It'll take hours before deconfliction takes place between China and America, who don't yet realize they have the same goal, at least in this regard. 12 hours after launch. The North Korean nuclear launch was meant to be a show of force, a deterrent to U.S. involvement in a renewed breakout of the Korean Civil War that never truly ended. Kim Jong-un was showing his willingness to use nuclear weapons in a bid to scare the U.S. away from supporting the South militarily. However, it was the attack against South Korea's ports that ensured a U.S. response would be extremely difficult. With all of South Korea's major ports obliterated by nuclear detonations, America will be forced to disembark heavy equipment with its amphibious assault capabilities, severely slowing its response time. The ground-level detonations flash evaporated millions of tons of seawater and destroyed large parts of sprawling harbors. They were not powerful enough to destroy the host cities, but have caused massive amounts of contamination, which threatens the lives of millions. A mass exodus from port cities has begun in an attempt to beat the fallout. Despite warnings from local governments that everyone should shelter in place for up to 3 days in order for radioactivity levels to die down significantly, few listen, and many of the fleeing millions will become ill with radiation poisoning. A quarter of them will die. At the DMZ, the largest battle since the Second World War is playing out, as an initially overwhelmed U.S. and South Korean force is rocked back by the brutality of the North's attack. The millions of mines laid across the DMZ have done little to slow down the assault, which is being led by the North's most fanatical armored and infantry divisions, soldiers who will face the greatest casualties and were thus picked for their zealot devotion to the supreme leader. The alliance's firepower is overwhelming, but so are the North's numbers. Plus, the chemical attack against South Korea carried out by agents disguised as city sanitation workers has severely slowed down the response to the North's surprise attack. Even now, unaware of the extent and risk of contamination, railways remain shut down. News of an intercepted nuclear attack, as well as the 5 detonations in the south, have caused widespread panic and a mass exodus of South Korean citizens toward the south of their country. This has caused massive traffic jams that further complicate the military response. At the moment, it's only overwhelming Allied air power that's keeping the North's attack blunted and from overwhelming the primary lines of defense. But just in case, roads and bridges across the DMZ have been prepared for demolition for decades and will be sabotaged to slow the North Korean tidal wave. In Seoul, the city is burning from a massive concentration of artillery fire, but rapid counter-battery fire and the South's attack helicopter fleet has disrupted the North's plan to hold the city hostage via long-range artillery. Firefighters work to put out blazes even amidst the ongoing barrage, which slows by the hour as the South's specialized counter-battery crews methodically destroy Northern artillery with precision rounds. The steady stream of attack helicopters to and from the DMZ never stops as they return to friendly airfields to rearm and refuel before setting back out again. The lives of millions of Seoul citizens rest on these brave pilots' shoulders and the counter-battery crews. The war for South Korea has just begun, and America's ability to rapidly deploy mechanized forces into the nation has been severely slowed due to the atomic attacks against major harbors. The fate of the democratic South now rests on its military's ability to hold out until major American and Japanese reinforcements arrive, which could take weeks. Meanwhile, American and Japanese warplanes join South Korea's Air Force in the sky and run 24-hour operations to hammer the invading North's forces from above. But can air power alone stop a military that's over 3 times the size of South Korea's? And what'll happen when China uses America's engagement in a difficult Korean war to launch its own invasion of Taiwan? America may be a military superpower, but its resources are not unlimited, and taking its eye off South Korea could lead to the nation's collapse. Somewhere deep inside a secret bunker, Kim Jong-un still lurks, in full control of at least 24 hidden launchers, each carrying missiles with the range to strike the American homeland. Will the South survive, or will Kim end up victorious? Some people go to the Caribbean or Europe to enjoy a relaxing holiday. Others choose North Korea. Little did Otto Warmbier know that less than 2 years later, he would be leaving the country in a vegetative state. It was supposed to be a fun, budget tour of the country, but one day Otto went too far. He didn't get blackout drunk or punch a military officer. He did something arguably even worse: stole a propaganda poster, at least so the allegation goes. When the powers that be found out, he'd be sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in North Korea's prison system, a reasonable sentence for such a treacherous crime. Yet it didn't take long for Otto to be so worn down that he'd be carried into a plane on a stretcher, boasting deformed limbs, serious brain damage, and incapable of eating. What about North Korea's prison system could be so harsh that it would break this prom king and bright college student in a matter of months? Let's rewind to the start of this ultimate fall from grace. Otto was in the Pyongyang airport ready to leave the country when officials pulled him aside after seeing his passport. A tour buddy made a joke that it'd be the last time they'd see each other again. Little did he know that his words would be true. The good news is that foreign prisoners in North Korea have special treatment compared to locals who are arrested. The government sees the value of foreigners as human bargaining chips who can play a part in easing the punitive sanctions the country faces. But there's bad news too. Less awful is still awful. First, foreign prisoners go to a guest house, or if they're lucky, a budget hotel, while they await trial. It's basically still a prison since they can't leave and are watched constantly by North Korean secret police, but that's preferable to a labor camp. While there, they're hardly left alone to mope around all day. Detainees can expect to face interrogation for up to 15 hours a day for weeks on end. It's all part of the process to wear prisoners down psychologically and manipulate them into confessing they're guilty of whatever they've been accused of. The interrogators have zero interest in discovering accurate information or figuring out what really happened. They already know what your story is, they just want to make sure that you know it too. If you want to keep both your life and your sanity, it's best to just go along with it and confess everything. All ready for a false confession during your so-called trial. North Korea appoints some prisoners their own lawyers to go through the motions, but those legal professionals serve the function of scolding the detainees rather than protecting them. Expect accusations of insulting the Kim dynasty or conspiring against the state, rather than discussions about what's happened and whether you're guilty. The purpose of the exercise is most likely to trick the accused into confessing for their sins. But we have to give credit where credit is due. Most past North Korean prisoners have admitted that the country treated them reasonably well. Foreign prisoners may receive beatings when they're first captured, but as soon as their nationality is established, the state doesn't lay a hand on them. Ultimately, North Korea accepts that they will someday have to send their prisoners back to their home countries, and they want the world to know how benevolent and reliable they are. So if this is what we call special treatment of foreigners, you might be wondering what exactly the locals have to go through. In 2 words, beatings and torture. Locals are treated like animals for having the audacity to defy the state they grew up in. Firstly, they're placed in rooms that often have nothing other than a mold-covered toilet and sink, not even a bed. Their rounds of interrogation are far more likely to get physical, and they're forced to cooperate without even a fake lawyer. In terms of food, they can expect delicious delicacies like rice mixed with dirt and gravel. Yummy. Once a week, they might get the chance to wash themselves using a bucket of hot water. There's no form of entertainment other than sitting and thinking. Occasionally, inmates might be allowed luxuries such as pencils and paper, or even better, biographies of Kim Jong-il and his father. There's nothing like learning about the inner life of your oppressor to distract you from your oppression. Psychological torture, however, is in the cards for everyone, North Koreans and foreigners alike. North Korea likes its prisoners to remain feeling isolated and hopeless so they can be more easily controlled and manipulated. Inmates have no contact with the outside world, and the foreigners are told their countries are doing nothing to try to rescue them. Even if negotiations to release prisoners are actually coming close to a conclusion, the prisoners have no idea until the moment they're about to be released. So, if you ever go to North Korea and face arrest, don't believe a word they tell you. It's unlikely that local prisoners get any kind of meaningful trial, but foreigners at least get to pretend they do. Delegates from their home country are present, although they have little power over the verdict. The whole process is extremely short. Judges make their decisions almost instantly about what'll happen based on the false confessions of the accused. A life sentence in a labor camp is pretty standard, but if you're unlucky, you could face the death penalty. Otto received a sentence for 15 years of hard labor during his trial. He appeared on the screen in a news conference confession where he broke down sobbing on camera and said that stealing the poster was the greatest mistake of his life. That would be the last time that most people would see him still capable of standing up and talking. Finally, Otto was taken to prison. There are currently around 150,000 to 200,000 people detained in North Korean prisons, or maybe even more. Amongst them are a few foreign nationals, mostly South Koreans. Inmates can expect to work on projects like coal mining while facing debilitating conditions and surviving on starvation rations. As before, foreigners get things slightly easier since their deaths would be bad press. So what on earth did happen in these prisons? How did Otto obtain this inexplicable brain damage? As an American, he was probably taken to a special labor camp exclusively for foreigners. Labor activities there include planting soybeans, making bricks, and shoveling coal. Cells consist of a bed, a toilet, and a little else. And what about the locals? You're gonna wish you never even asked. North Koreans, who often face decade-long sentences for offenses as innocent as watching banned soap operas from South Korea or digging for edible plants, have a real tough time behind bars. Sometimes 3 generations of family will be in prison just to punish one person. The political prisons, also known as kwanliso, are the worst. Most are precincts protected with electric fencing, barbed wire, and even guard towers. Detainees are forced to dig their own graves while guards taunt them, raped as punishment for bad behavior, and tortured for not working hard enough. Sometimes prisoners disappear entirely. Newborns of prisoners have been fed to dogs. Amongst the numbers include thousands of child prisoners, many of whom are starved and overworked to death. Even for the soft foreign prisoners, life in a labor camp is harsh. Inmates are held in stinky, unkempt buildings infested with mosquitoes, cockroaches, and insects. The dilapidated structures feature undrinkable tap water and broken lights. They're surrounded by guards, but completely isolated from any other prisoners. Wake-up time is at 6 a.m. when a loudspeaker rudely awakens the prisoner, alerting them that they should get dressed. As a bonus, they might also get screamed at by guards, who call them by their number rather than their name and tell them they'll be stuck behind bars forever. Breakfast is a meager portion of white bread and some water. Then it's off to work, from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., all alone, of course. Cameras and guards watch every move of the prisoners during their labor to make sure they don't make a single wrong move. For lunch and dinner, it's back to rice with gravel. But once a week, there's a real treat: a boiled egg. I guess the officials accepted that some form of protein might be necessary for non-stop hard labor. Sometimes prisoners also get their hands on potato or salted cabbage, because apparently cabbage is supposed to be something to look forward to now. The weirdest part of prison time is in the evening, or so-called cultural time. You might expect this involves learning about the wonderful culture of North Korea, maybe some music or art. Nope. Prisoners are simply left alone with no stimuli, perhaps to dream up the culture in their head. Even foreign prisoners are offered minimal protection from the elements. Winter gets cold in North Korea, yet prisoners are expected to use their bare hands to dig through frosty ground and to wander around without proper shoes or warm clothing. And that's right, I've been only talking about the easy ride the foreigners had up until now. Nationals have things way worse. After waking up at 5 a.m. at the latest, the prisoners must carry out hard labor until 7 p.m. And you thought the 9 to 5 was bad. The only break is for 1 hour at lunch, which consists of a measly portion of salt and corn. Hardly the most filling meal at the best of times. Never mind when you're performing 11 hours of grueling tasks. It's not surprising most people resort to eating mice, insects, frogs, and anything else they can find to protect themselves from malnutrition. When times got really desperate, they might even turn to corn left out for the animals or even beans stuck in animal dung, and I'll let that one sink in for a while. Even worse, the prisoners have to walk more than 12 miles just to reach their workplace, usually a field of some kind. If you thought the foreign prisoners had it bad for needing to dig using their bare hands, try plowing a field while carrying a cart like a horse expected to run instead of walking. Pregnant women are made to do particularly strenuous work, like going up and down hills to ensure they suffer miscarriages. Then again, they're the ones who have it lucky because it's not unheard of for newborn babies to be fed to the dogs, while the mothers are made to watch. As the detainees work, North Korean officials hurl verbal abuse at them. Despite the desperate conditions, there's no room for error. Make a minor mistake or step out of line and you can expect to be subject to beatings or torture, or worse. Once a month, there are public executions for the most problematic prisoners. Sometimes they're killed by their fellow prisoners who are forced to throw rocks at bodies hung alive from scaffolds. In the evenings, there are meetings until late at night, meaning most prisoners never manage more than a few hours sleep. Not that they have a bed to sleep in anyway. Whoever you are, North Korean prisons are brutal, but most people don't end up in a vegetative state, at least not as far as we know. So what really happened to Otto, the American tourist? How did he end up with brain damage after his arrest? North Korean officials claim Otto suffered an unexpected reaction to a sleeping pill, which caused a rare condition called botulism. But the US officials say the young man's injuries were from beatings and torture. What's the truth? Strangely, reports suggest that Otto never even made it to a labor camp or prison. Just one day after his trial and press conference, the staff at the hotel detaining Otto reported he became unresponsive. He had to be resuscitated, given oxygen, and put on a ventilator to save his life. At that point, he most likely went directly to the place he was cared for until his return to the US. If this is true, the cause of his condition becomes even more mysterious. How could Otto be completely normal one day yet fall prey to a fatal condition before he even faced the horrendous North Korean prison conditions? Once Otto reached the hospital, it seems healthcare professionals cared for him extremely well. US officials admitted he'd probably received around-the-clock care, noting an impressive lack of bed sores for someone in a vegetative state. You've gotta give it to North Korea, even if the motivation was covering their own asses. Unfortunately, it was not enough to save Otto's life. Shortly after he returned to the US, he passed away. Nobody really knows what happened while the young man was detained, and it's unlikely we ever will. Two possibilities are an allergic reaction or a suicide attempt provoked by psychological torture. On June 25, 1950, 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army rushed across the 38th parallel, a boundary drawn up between the United States and the Soviet Union, which separated Korea into North and South, with the North communist and firmly aligned with the Soviet Union, and the South democratic and aligned with the United States. 1 month later, the United States would enter the war, anxious to achieve a quick armistice with the North out of fear of dragging in the Soviet Union or China and launching World War III. But how did a war that would last to this day begin? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're telling the story of the Korean War. Korea was seized as part of the Japanese Empire early on in the 20th century. After a stunning defeat of Russia, the world was forced to accept that Japan was a new world power, and Japan itself was eager to add to its territories. Unfortunately for the people of Korea, this meant that the Japanese army would occupy the nation until the end of World War II. Upon Japan's defeat, however, something needed to be done about its former imperial holdings. As part of its unconditional surrender, Japan was forced to recall its armies in Asia back to its home island, and to give up most of its overseas territories. Yet, while Manchuria would be returned to the Chinese, nobody had any idea about what to do with Korea. Ultimately, the nation was divided along the 38th parallel, and in a bid to seek to pacify the Soviet Union, Soviet forces were allowed to take control of the North, and the Americans would take control of the South. Nobody, by the way, had bothered to ask the Koreans what they themselves wanted. By 1950, the South was controlled by anti-communist dictator Syngman-rhee, which the US very reluctantly supported. The North, however, was enthusiastically supported by the Soviet Union, who had installed Kim Il-sung as its leader. Both men wanted to reunify Korea under their own rule, and border skirmishes between the two nations were common, with almost 10,000 troops killed in battle before the war officially began. Then came the major offensive from the North in the summer of 1950. For the United States, the conflict was not a border dispute between two rival nations, but rather part of a larger and growing struggle between the forces of communism and democracy. The United States considered non-interference an impossibility, and a secret National Security Council report even recommended that the United States use military force to contain communist expansionism anywhere in the world, regardless of the intrinsic strategic or economic value of the lands in question. For the US, the die was cast, and what was quickly seen as a war of aggression backed by the Soviet Union was met with US troops. President Harry Truman would go on to say, "If we let Korea down, the Soviets will keep right on going and swallow up one place after another." This anti-communist sentiment would in later years lead to the domino effect theory, which claimed that if one nation was allowed to fall to communism, it would pave the way for many others to do the same. While the anti-communist fervor of the United States would come to be derided by later generations, the truth is that the Soviet Union very much wanted a unified communist Korea, also believing that an ultimate confrontation between democracy and communism was inevitable. And if that fight was to come, then the only way for any side to survive was to have the most allies. In short, everyone believed that World War III was inevitable. Despite the intervention of the United States and its allies, the war initially went very badly for the democratic forces. North Korean forces were backed with Soviet equipment and had received extensive training from Soviet military advisors. In fact, many of North Korea's operations were being actively planned by Soviet generals, who put their vast experience combating the Japanese in Manchuria and the Germans in Eastern Europe to great effect. North Korean forces were numerous, well-disciplined, well-equipped, and had high morale. By contrast, South Korean forces had not received much training and suffered from very poor morale. U.S. soldiers would often find their South Korean allies fleeing from battle at the slightest provocation, and desertion was a common problem for South Korean military leaders. While the U.S. was initially supposed to supplement South Korean forces and fight a defensive battle to push the North out of the South, they soon found themselves carrying the brunt of the battle. The extreme heat also worked against the American soldiers, who suffered from logistic and supply problems and were often forced to refill their drinking canteens from rice paddies, which had been fertilized with human waste. This led to outbreaks of disease and illness, which further decreased U.S. strength. The U.S. desperately needed to relieve pressure on its forces, and it was decided that an amphibious invasion behind North Korean forces would be launched. The plan was extremely risky. If the landings went poorly, then American forces would be destroyed on the beaches, overwhelmed by superior North Korean firepower. Yet if it was successful, then North Korea forces would be cut off from their supply lines and forced to fight on two fronts at the same time. Kim Il-sung, leader of North Korea, was completely aware of the vulnerability of his forces to being flanked by landings at his rear, and had even received some intel from the Soviets that American landings at Incheon were possible. Yet Kim Il-sung did not believe that the Americans would attempt such a landing, as Incheon's beaches were notoriously treacherous and difficult terrain, and its dangerous tides only afforded a few hours of safety for landing craft. On September 15th, 40,000 American troops and 8,600 South Korean troops forced a landing at Incheon, fully 100 miles behind the North's lines. The attack was a complete surprise to the North, and the landing force met with relatively light resistance. From the east, American tank battalions rushed to encircle the North Korean forces, threatening to trap the bulk of the North Korean army in the south. North Korean forces rapidly retreated back to Seoul, the South's capital, which they had seized early on in the war. A vicious battle leveled much of Seoul and saw the North's forces put in full retreat, with only 30,000 North Korean soldiers making it back to the north. The way to Pyongyang was now clear, and an end to the war was in sight. Back in the Soviet Union, Stalin berated several of his military commanders for the poor performance of the North Korean military and held them personally responsible. Some of them would not survive their failures. President Truman, however, warned that advances into North Korea should be careful not to provoke China, as he feared that it would lead to China's entry into the war and prompt the Soviets to initiate attacks in Europe, launching the much-feared democracy versus communism World War III. China's Mao Zedong had in fact warned the UN that in the case of safeguarding Chinese national security, they would intervene if necessary against UN forces in Korea. American General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the UN forces in Korea, however, was sure that China wouldn't dare risk full-out war against the US, especially given the fact that the nation still lacked any serious military hardware and relied on mass infantry formations. He also resented what he thought of as President Truman's appeasement of the Chinese, and thus, while President Truman tried to prevent war with the Chinese, General MacArthur actively tried to provoke it. Unbeknownst to MacArthur, he was about to get his wish, as for weeks now, Chinese military forces had been moving into North Korea. While UN forces had encountered various Chinese military units, these were small in size and thought to be nothing more than volunteers. Thus, General MacArthur ignored intelligence that said a growing Chinese force was massing in the mountains, believing that any Chinese in North Korea were volunteer fighters and not actual troops. Meanwhile, Stalin had been secretly communicating with Mao Zedong, telling him to send several infantry divisions into North Korea, but warning that Soviet forces would not intercede in the fight. Diplomatic discussions between Mao and Stalin led to Stalin agreeing to lend some material support but no combat troops, and that he would offer the support of the Soviet Air Force but only over Chinese airspace. This would be of little use to the Chinese forces as none of the fighting was taking place in China itself. Still, some Soviet pilots did fly missions against UN forces, though they were careful to always remain near the Chinese border in case they were shot down. China immediately supplemented its forces in North Korea with a force of 200,000 troops, which incredibly completely evaded detection by UN aerial reconnaissance. This was achieved by marching only at nighttime and setting up elaborate camouflage while resting during the day. Strict discipline was enforced, and soldiers were to immediately duck for cover and remain motionless if any aircraft were spotted overhead. Chinese officers were authorized to shoot any security violators, and the measures, while draconian, allowed 3 divisions of Chinese infantry to completely surprise South Korean and UN forces. Deep in North Korea, Chinese forces routed a South Korean army and then completely encircled the US's 8th Cavalry Regiment, launching attacks from the north, northwest, and west. UN forces were forced to retreat, but despite the huge success of their attack, the Chinese mysteriously retreated to mountain hideouts instead of pushing the attack and capitalizing on their victory. Because of the sudden withdrawal, though, UN command did not believe that China had truly committed to the war, and thus continued to push north. This would result in another series of deadly Chinese ambushes, the most famous being the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, in which 30,000 UN troops, mostly Americans from the US's X-Corps, were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese troops. The Chinese were ordered to completely destroy UN forces. However, for 17 days, UN forces held their own under a brutal wintertime assault. Eventually, the encircled forces were able to break through the Chinese lines, and with the aid of American Marines and the US Army's Task Force were able to retreat. The battle would see 1,000 UN soldiers killed, with 20,000 Chinese killed, mostly due to the superior equipment and tactics of the Americans and their British and South Korean allies. The battle, however, marked the end of offensive operations in North Korea. With China fully committed, President Truman desperately wanted to avoid a Third World War, and thus ordered UN forces to move back to the 38th parallel. As negotiations took place, fighting continued along the 38th parallel until finally, after 2 years of negotiations, an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. A ceasefire, which lasts to this day, was immediately put into effect, but a satisfactory end to the Korean War was never achieved. Sadly, hostilities between North and South are still at an all-time high, and the continued backing of Russia and China allow North Korea, impoverished as it is, to survive. As of the writing of this episode, rumors abound from the Hermit Kingdom of North Korea, indicating that its supreme leader Kim Jong-un may have suffered a serious health event. Some even claim that the dear leader is in fact dead. News that has sent the intelligence agencies of every Western nation, as well as those of Japan and South Korea, in a mad scramble to discover the truth. As of this episode writing, Japanese media outlets have reported that the North Korean leader is in a vegetative state, though the rumors have yet to be substantiated. Careful observation of North Korean military forces and communication patterns seem to indicate that there is nothing out of the ordinary going on in the secret kingdom. But it's impossible to say for certain yet what's really happening north of the demilitarized zone. But what if Kim Jong-un, supreme leader of North Korea, chairman of the Workers' Party, and supreme commander of the armed forces really did die? What would that mean for North Korea, and what would it mean for the rest of the world? The question of North Korea's succession has always been a tricky one. Kim Il-sung, the founder and the first supreme leader of North Korea, understood that governments underwent their greatest reformations during power transitions, and thus labored to create a monarchic communist system that would ensure little, if any, change took place after his death. In a traditional communist state, the party secretary general is elected by the National People's Committee, which is itself made up of members elected into office by the various districts that they represent. Needless to say, in North Korea there's not much voting of any sort, and certainly not from the average people. In North Korea, this Soviet-style process is completely circumvented. The National People's Committee is instead made up of appointments by the Supreme Leader himself based on loyalty of candidates, their merits, and recommendations from other senior and completely loyal party officials. In order to ensure the smooth transfer of power and their own continued survival, each Kim family member to take the throne has labored to fill the National Committee with loyalists who will not challenge their power or their choice of successor. However, having a clear successor in the first place is important. and Kim Jong-un lacked such a line of succession. When Kim Il-sung neared his death, he quickly began to groom his son, Kim Jong-il, to take power once he was gone. Kim Jong-il took on increasing government responsibility, giving him an air of legitimacy and competency long before his father actually died. As Kim Jong-il neared his own death, which was more sudden and unexpected than that of Kim Il-sung, he hastily appointed Kim Jong-un as his successor. The sudden appointment left many in doubt as to the future of the Kim dynasty in North Korea. At 28 years old, Kim Jong-un was not only young but inexperienced in leadership and the particular political intrigue of North Korea. He was quickly appointed to senior government and party positions, including the powerful National Defense Commission, and was granted the rank of a 4-star general, despite having no military experience. Senior party and military officials were immediately signed to him as mentors, and it quickly became clear to all that Kim Jong-il was planning for his young son to take over after his death. Despite all the preparation, though, the initial transition period was fraught with uncertainties. Even with his grooming and training, many believed that Kim Jong-un was too young, inexperienced, and weak to lead, and most analysts suspected that ultimately, while he may remain on the throne, other more powerful political elites within North Korea would be calling the shots. In effect, Kim Jong-un would become a figurehead and nothing more, with his puppet strings being pulled by those behind the scenes. It was believed that the vice chairman Jang Song-thaek would either outright take the throne or call the real shots in North Korea, or that the military would turn against the young Kim Jong-un and manipulate him under threat of death. Any number of his senior mentors were also believed to be in the running for ousting the new Kim, or simply becoming the shadow princes behind the throne. Much to the shock of everyone, none of those things happened, and instead Kim Jong-un proved just as ruthless as his predecessors in consolidating power. Most of his mentors, some of whom were suspected of outright trying to manipulate Kim, were killed or sent to prison camps, and a purge amongst the rest of the party elite removed any threats to Kim's power, going so far as to kill or imprison the men who had been faithfully loyal to his father for decades. Even Kim's own family members weren't safe. Kim Jong-nam, his brother-in-law, had no interest in political power, yet that did not save him from Kim Jong-un sending assassins to kill him while on a trip in Malaysia. While Kim Jong-nam might have had no aspirations for power, Kim Jong-un likely feared that the political elite within North Korea might use him as a figurehead to install on the throne after overthrowing Kim Jong-un. He likely also feared that Kim Jong-nam would be installed by South Korea and U.S. forces after a war against the North. Kim Jong-un very quickly eliminated all his rivals and possible successors to his father's throne, cementing himself as the top leader in North Korea. In order to fend the powerful North Korean military off, the biggest threat to his power, Kim Jong-un also instituted a military-first policy that saw the military receive priority treatment from the new government. While successful, Kim Jong-un's transition to power had the benefit of 2 years of careful grooming by his father, and under a new succession would not. If the supreme leader died today, North Korea may look very different tomorrow. Kim Jong-un has no clear successor, and it's believed that in the case of his untimely death, it would be his sister, Kim Yo-jong, who would be granted power. This would be a dangerous proposition for the Kim dynasty, though, since while Kim Yo-jong holds some position of political power in North Korea, the overwhelmingly patriarchal social structure of North Korea would likely see her regarded by many as an illegitimate ruler. Kim Yo-jong would have to be twice as ruthless as her brother if she wanted to retain the power, and yet in the end she might not be able to fend off a coup from within. While a member of the Kim family and a direct descendant of the original supreme leader to whom all Kim family members owe their legitimacy to, the fact that Kim Yo-jong is a woman would seriously weaken her claim to power. It's likely then that if Kim Yo-jong did retain leadership, she would serve as nothing more than a figurehead, exactly the fate that Kim Jong-un feared so much. However, she might very well be ousted completely, and there are two major threats to her power. The first comes from Chae Young-hae, who is currently the country's number 2 man, a ruthless political elite with decades of experience and a direct link to Kim Jong-il as his trusted confidant. Not only does Chae Young-hae have a great deal of legitimacy as a political leader, his personal relationship with Kim Jong-un gives him some legitimacy with the Kim dynasty himself, and it's unlikely that the entire concept of a Kim dynasty would be trashed overnight. The hero worship of Kim Il-sung is simply too deeply entrenched in North Korean culture for that. Having Chae Young-hae step in as leader would likely be seen as acceptable to the North Korean people, especially if it was a, quote, temporary measure, end quote, until a true Kim successor could be named. In that case, Kim Yo-jong would likely be left in a position of power, though it would be Chae Young-hae who called all the shots. Kim Yo-jong's only role would be to serve as a link to the Kim dynasty, though inevitably she might suffer a terrible accident. After all, if Chae Young-hae is only acting as a regent until a worthy Kim successor can be found, then one of her sons could eventually take power for himself away from Chae Young-hae. Along with Kim Yo-jong, a large number of Kim family members would likely meet with similar accidents. A second threat to Kim Yo-jong's throne would come from the military itself, the single most powerful apparatus within the nation. While Kim Jong-un's military-first policy was meant to earn him the loyalty of the military, and it did, it has also served to cement its power in North Korean politics, and no successor to the Kim dynasty could take the role of supreme leader without their support. Whether an actual Kim family member or an outsider, the military could not only seize power in the event of Kim Jong-un's sudden death, it's very well positioned to do so. Not only is it the largest martial force in North Korea, its members also have deep ties to the national security agencies of the nation. No leader will take the North Korean throne without their approval. The most important thing, though, is if a successor comes from within the Kim family or not, as that will dictate how North Korea interacts with the rest of the world. While a Kim family member could over time change North Korea's relationship with the world, it would be an extremely slow and protracted process. Currently, the nation is ostracized by the world and economically sanctioned over its nuclear program and small stockpile of nuclear weapons. The international bloc standing against North Korea is led by the United States, which has made it clear it will not entertain any negotiations that don't include nuclear disarmament. This, however, is a problem for a Kim family member, as nuclear weapons are deeply tied to the legacy of the Kim dynasty. Kim Jong-un himself depended on the success of the nation's nuclear program, and had it failed to produce a working nuclear weapon, it's widely believed he would have been forcibly removed from power. In many ways, his continued hold on power is still dependent on nuclear weapons, and any abandonment of the North's nuclear program would be seen as treason against both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, as well as deeply anger the powerful military. If a new Kim family member were to take power, abandonment of the nuclear program would be tantamount to suicide. In a sense, a new Kim ruler has their hands tied at the international negotiation table with regard to nuclear disarmament. And for now, the issue of North Korean nuke development is a moot one. National policy will likely never change as long as a Kim rules. However, an outsider such as Chae Young-hae could afford to institute major reforms if he wanted to. That is, of course, if he could find a way to keep the military from immediately removing him if he threatened to disarm their nuclear weapons. The prospects of having sanctions lifted and the massive economic benefit and international aid that would come as a result could be very appealing to many party officials, though, and even some senior military leaders. It would certainly be so for the average North Korean citizen, who could see their lifestyle radically change thanks to an influx of foreign aid and investment as the Hermit Kingdom rejoins the world. Certainly, the prosperity of South Korea is a powerful lure to a possible successor to Kim Jong-un. And even if the military did not support nuclear disarmament and other major reforms, the citizens who would at last receive international aid and economic revival could make it very difficult for the military to replace a reformist leader. Whatever happens in North Korea's future, it's clear that the only real chance for change is if a non-Kim family member were to take power. Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un has recently shaken up his military cabinet, while warning that the military must be prepared for imminent war. What does Kim know that we don't, or is this more bluster? And if war were to break out, just how effective would the North's military be against the South-US alliance? Military shakeups are nothing new in the highest echelons of power in the North Korean military. In fact, Kim Jong-un regularly shuffles around senior personnel, sometimes for perceived failures, but most of the time to keep any one individual from amassing too much power. After all, as a dictator, Kim Jong's greatest threats come from within. However, it was a chilling warning that the North Korean military should be prepared for imminent war that made many take notice of this shakeup. The nation spends around $4 billion on its military every year, or about 25% of the country's entire GDP. That's about what the US will spend on a single military program given its vast $800 billion defense budget. Its weapons are largely antiquated, training is considered to be poor to non-existent, and its logistics are believed to be even worse than Russia's, which is really saying something. Yet the punch the North Korean military has might just surprise you. By the numbers, there's really no comparison between the two powers. The only area where there's even remote parity is in the total number of active duty personnel. North Korea has around 1.2 million active duty personnel versus the US's 1.39 million. When it comes to reservists, North Korea enjoys the advantage with over 600,000 versus the US's 442,000. But there's a bigger story here than numbers. US soldiers are far better trained and equipped than their northern counterparts. The U.S. Army alone is spending 4 times the total North Korean military budget on readiness and training in 2023-2024. In total, the U.S. Army, Marines, Air Force, Navy, and Space Force are spending over 3 times the entire GDP of North Korea on training and readiness for the fiscal years of 23 and 24. This training includes individual and unit training, as well as large-scale combined arms exercises with partner services and foreign allies. The U.S. trains how it fights, adopting the maxim that it's better to sweat in training than bleed in war, and the results are reflected in the one-sided loss ratios experienced by the U.S. military. North Korean training is largely conducted at the unit level, with each unit responsible for individual proficiency. With very few exceptions over the last decades, a large-scale training exercise involving large formations or combined arms operations are non-existent. Further, a lack of budget plagues North Korean units the way it does Russian units. For soldiers not in special units, typically those in the capital or with ceremonial purposes, training can be altogether non-existent. Hunger is also a constant concern, with 2 or 3 potatoes per meal or raw corn kernels or corn rice making up the vast majority of meals per northern defectors. This directly results in what's been termed the shrinking North Korean army, where northern soldiers on average are several inches shorter than their southern counterparts. Training is also typically superseded by labor-intensive tasks. Soldiers are used for general labor, assisting farmers in rice paddies or in constructing roads and other infrastructure. Corruption also eats away at the North Korean military, though not at the scale of the Russian military. Corruption tends to be localized to the top leadership, with rank-and-file soldiers being made example of for committing the same acts their commanders are guilty of, and this typically means imprisonment, beatings, or death. Malnutrition is such a significant problem in the North Korean army that soldiers are regularly sent home to recover from its effects. Once they're healthy once more, they're rounded up to complete their mandatory military service. Defectors have claimed that sometimes soldiers simply starve to death during their service, though there are instances of good commanders looking after their troops and keeping them healthy, preventing this from occurring. Typically, hunger is so prevalent that soldiers have a notorious reputation for stealing anything edible that they can get their hands on, making them unpopular with local civilians. North Korea's reserve force is over 150,000 stronger than the U.S.'s, reflecting the North Korean Constitution, which enshrines every North Korean's duty to the military in law. However, reservists receive no official training upon release from the military, and it's completely unknown how realistic North Korea's ability to mobilize and arm the 600,000 reservists truly is. Given the horrible conditions inside the military, it's also unknown how many would even answer the call to mobilize, forcing North Korea to expend significant resources simply trying to gather up its reservists in the first place. By comparison, American reservists receive regular training, typically 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. U.S. reserves also regularly receive combat deployments, both to supplement the active duty force and to ensure skills and competency remain sharp. The U.S. Reserve program is a well-oiled machine, completely on its own. America's reserve force is a match for most military powers. There's one glaring exception to the state of North Korean training and readiness, and that's its vast Special Forces cadre. It's estimated that North Korea has around 200,000 Special Forces soldiers, making it the largest Special Forces in the world. By comparison, only about 3% of the entire U.S. military is designated as being a part of its most elite force. The quality of its Special Forces has some variation, but overall these soldiers have shown a high degree of proficiency and training, taking part in ongoing infiltrations and operations against the South since the late 1960s. They have also been observed carrying very modern equipment which would not be found anywhere else in the North Korean military, including night and thermal vision equipment, armored vests, and other pieces of sophisticated kit. North Korean Special Forces are broken down into various roles. Its most elite soldiers are known as Lightning Commandos, and they're meant to directly counter American Navy SEALs and South Korean Navy Special Warfare Flotilla operatives. These are the elite of the elite, and are primarily tasked with foiling American and South Korean Special Forces operations against the North Korean military and the civilian leadership itself. Airborne commandos utilize Antonov AN-2 planes with the task of infiltrating the South in case of hostilities. While the Antonov AN-2 is antiquated, it has the advantage of being slightly more difficult to track on radar than a modern plane due to its material construction, and the plane excels on taking off and landing on very rough runways, perfect for a quick infiltration into the South. While all North Korean Special Forces are designed to create a second front in the enemy's rear, the airborne component is specifically suited to that task, quickly infiltrating past the front line to cause general chaos in the rear areas. The light infantry component of North Korean Special Forces is unique for its lack of any heavy equipment whatsoever. True to its role, this force is meant to infiltrate into the enemy's rear through concealed movement and then target lines of communication and high-value targets, such as air defense equipment, command and control nodes, etc. To accomplish this, they can carry only light arms and anti-tank weapons. It's even believed that they don't carry any actual body armor, instead wearing Kevlar vests akin to the second chance vests many police officers around the world utilize. Maritime SOF are designed to infiltrate South Korea's coastline and launch attacks against vulnerable rear area military and civilian targets. It's believed that North Korea can deliver as many as 7,000 commandos to South Korea beaches through the use of a vast fleet of midget submarines and 24 Romeo-class diesel-electric submarines specifically designed to deliver commandos onto enemy beaches. The rugged coastline of South Korea makes it very difficult to counter these submarines, and it's believed that in just one lift, the North could deliver 5,000 of these operators into the South. Reconnaissance brigades, also known as sniper brigades, are the type you're likely to be the most familiar with. These elite operators are tasked with gathering intelligence behind enemy lines, but are also trained in direct action missions. They're meant to destroy or seize strategic targets from South Korean or American forces, and it's these operators who carry out assassination missions in the region. North Korea's Air Force numbers at just shy of 1,000 aircraft, the vast majority of which are hopelessly antiquated. The nation still operates the MiG-17, MiG-19, MiG-21, and MiG-23 fighters, with a few MiG-29s. They may also have a small number of MiG-25s, though this is hotly debated. The nation's most numerous fighter is the MiG-21, an obsolete yet still capable platform. However, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency concluded that the North Korean Air Force could not prevail against U.S. forces due to, quote, overwhelming advantages in power projection, strategic air superiority, and precision-guided standoff strike capability. The USDIA also stated that the North would have a significant difficulty operating against the South's air defense capability. North Korea does have one of the densest air defense systems in the world, given America's overwhelming use of air power. However, the bulk of its air defenses are made up of Cold War-era SA-5 Gammon and domestically produced Hwanghae-5 SAMs. During Desert Storm, Iraq had one of the best air defense systems in the world, and it was systematically dismantled by Allied air power. In conflict against America, North Korea's even older and less capable air defense network would be easy prey to superior U.S. technology and tactics. The use of stealthy F-22s, F-35s, B-2s, and soon the B-21 would further reduce the effectiveness of North Korea's defenses. The North's army operates 6,645 tanks versus America's 5,500, minus 31 or so recently sent off to Ukraine. According to South Korean intelligence, the North's tank fleet is primarily made up of obsolete T-34s, T-54s, T-55s, T-62s, and Chinese Type 59s. There's also considerable doubt as to the readiness of the North's armored forces. Given the significant age of most of its inventory, it's doubtful many of them are even in an operational state today. Domestically made Chonma-ho tanks are believed to be a copy of the Soviet T-62, with similar capabilities, while the Pokpong-ho, its most recent addition, appears to be an attempt to replicate the Soviet T-72. North Korea's tank forces are not seen as a credible threat by either the US or the South, with the bulk of its forces, even if operational, being easy prey even to ROK or US infantry fighting vehicles. North Korea knows it has never been able to match the US and the South militarily, though, which is why it's invested in asymmetrical threats like cyber warfare, special forces, and nuclear weapons to deter or win a potential war before the US can fully enter the conflict. Where North Korea does shine, and partly as a reflection of this strategy, is in its artillery force. Previously, we've called artillery-heavy armies insurance for dumb militaries when comparing the composition of the Russian military versus NATO ones. The adage holds true: the Russian military is absolutely awful at its job, but with truly overwhelming amounts of artillery, Russia has managed to level the playing field against a military a fraction of the size of its own. Despite the adoption of precision-guided munitions and a few other innovations, artillery largely remains unchanged since World War II. It's all about shooting high explosives from really far away as fast as possible. Thus, artillery can be the great equalizer for a dumb military. Thus, North Korea employs nearly 13,000 pieces of artillery versus the US's 4,400. Despite being the most powerful military in the world, the The US operates a shockingly small artillery force, and that's because of its doctrine of utilizing precision air power for the role. Yet the staggering amount of artillery operated by North Korea presents a significant challenge of its own, and the South trains extensively in utilizing aircraft and counter-battery fire to destroy Northern artillery. With the South's capital, Seoul, being well within range of a large amount of the North's artillery, North Korea's trump card has always been the ability to level significant portions of the city with concentrated artillery fire in the opening hours of hostilities. Good intelligence on the North Korean Navy and its capabilities is shockingly difficult to verify, given the extreme lengths the North has gone to keep its Navy out of the limelight. It's known that the North's Navy is a green water navy, or a coastal force with little capability to project power far from its own shores. It's also mostly made up of submarines, meant to blockade southern ports in case of a war, or deliver huge amounts of infiltrating special forces through the use of a mini armada of midget submarines. North Korea's submarine fleet is designed specifically to complicate US military response and hold southern shipping at risk. And despite being largely made up of obsolete Cold War-era boats like the Whiskey, Romeo, Yugo, and Hungnam-class subs, they can be surprisingly difficult to locate when powered down and lurking in ambush. Nearly all North Korean submarines, even its smaller Yono class, which are designed to infiltrate small groups of special forces, have the capability of laying mines, further complicating the naval environment around the peninsula. A growing arsenal of long-range missiles could give the North subs the ability to threaten both land and sea targets, though it's unknown just how effective these attacks would be against modern air defenses. North Korea also operates 2 light frigates of the Najin class, with one being modernized in 2014, and a small fleet of corvettes armed with anti-ship missiles. It also operates a small fleet of missile and torpedo boats, meant to quickly strike targets before disengaging. The most recent acquisition is the Nongo-class stealth missile boat, a catamaran-style design with some stealthy characteristics to reduce its radar signature. Against an American fleet of 484 ships, including 11 supercarriers, 9 amphibious assault carriers, 68 submarines, 92 destroyers, and 22 corvettes, the North's Navy has no chance. But it wasn't designed to win a stand-up fight. Rather, the North's main focus is to inflict a high cost on any responding American naval forces or on those of the South itself. Just how effective it would be at doing this is in serious doubt though, given the US's vast ISR capabilities and long-range targeting. The only credible threat the North has is its fleet of 35 diesel-electric submarines, which can lurk in ambush on battery power and can be very difficult to identify in shallow waters. North Korea's greatest weapon is its growing arsenal of nuclear bombs. It's believed that the North has around 100 nuclear weapons in its arsenal today and has test-fired missiles which place the entire continental United States under threat. However, its arsenal of long-range missiles is likely extremely limited and not sufficient to overcome the US's ballistic missile defenses, both in theater, across the Pacific, and on the homeland itself. The real threat of the North's nuclear arsenal is a short-range attack against the South or even Japan, with fears that the North could infiltrate portable nuclear weapons into the South's major harbors and detonate them in place, significantly slowing down America's ability to transport forces from across the Pacific into South Korea and causing massive civilian casualties. North Korea remains completely militarily outclassed by the US and South Korea, but it's a foe that's made its own inevitable defeat even more painful than ever thanks to the arsenal of nuclear weapons and estimated 5,000 tons of chemical agents. North Korea is full of secrets. Some are better kept than others. In the case of Kim Jong-un's wife, there may be dark facts about her past and how she got to where she is that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea does not want you to know about. The truth is, Ri Sol-ju is shrouded in mystery. Who is she, really? Why does she disappear from the public's view from time to time? And what other insane facts have been uncovered about the Supreme Leader's wife? Ri Sol-ju was first seen with Kim Jong-un and identified as his wife during the opening of an amusement park in North Korea. This was an underwhelming way to be introduced as the First Lady of the most oppressive dictator on the planet. Once the North Korean state media confirmed that the woman with the Supreme Leader was in fact his wife, people frantically scrambled to figure out who she was and where she came from. Researchers hypothesized that Kim and Ri had likely been married since 2008. But due to heavy censorship in North Korea, it seemed as though Ri Sol-ju appeared out of thin air. But since 2012, stories have been leaked about her past, She also has enjoyed some insane perks as the wife of the dictator of North Korea and has even done some pretty crazy things as a result of the power. However, it's important to remember that Ri Sol-ju's life is not her own, and she has even been forced into some deranged situations. We're going to start at the beginning. In terms of Ri Sol-ju's life, it's unclear exactly when that is. No one but the heads of the North Korean government and Ri's family knows her real date of birth, but it's reported to be sometime between 1985 and 1989, putting her somewhere in her mid to late 30s. Nevertheless, it's not entirely clear when or how she first met Kim Jong-un. There's a mystery surrounding their first meeting, and it might well have been against her will. From what we've been able to uncover, Ri Sol-ju came from a relatively well-off family in North Korea. Her mother was supposedly a doctor and her father a professor. This meant she had certain opportunities most people in North Korea didn't. Even still, she and her family were powerless against what was to come. Before we get to the crazy stuff Ri Sol-ju had to go through as Kim Jong-un's wife, we are going to explore what she did before meeting with her future husband. It's surprising how little is known about Ri Sol-ju's upbringing or what she did before 2012 when she was thrust into the spotlight, but when word got out that Kim Jong-un had a new wife, some people immediately recognized who she was. After the reveal, South Korean intelligence got to work and uncovered some interesting things about the supreme leader's new wife. The information uncovered about the mysterious bride indicated that before becoming the wife of Kim Jong-un, Ri Sol-ju was supposedly quite talented. She not only was a musician, but also engaged in other physical activities that might have drawn the supreme leader's attention to her. For example, South Korean intelligence was able to track her back to China, where she studied music with a focus on singing. This opportunity would not be granted to just any North Korean citizen, so it's clear that from the beginning of her life, Ri was more privileged than many in her country. Along with singing solo, Ri also performed in the North Korean orchestra, which exemplifies her musical ability. There's no doubt that Ri was musically talented, but she was also engaged in another performing art. In 2005, she visited South Korea as a member of the North Korean cheerleading squad. These facts are surprising because we know very little about the lives of people from North Korea due to the intense censorship the government maintains over everything that happens in their country and with their people. What little knowledge we possess is either fed to the international press by the state media or from defectors of North Korea, as we will see later. There are very few outsiders who are allowed into North Korea, and even fewer that have ever actually met Ri Sol-ju. But one former NBA star has actually provided more information about Kim Jong-un's wife than many other sources due to the fact that he is quite friendly with the supreme leader. What makes learning the truth about who Ri Sol-ju was so difficult is that North Korean officials are actively trying to erase her past. Think of how crazy that is. Ri was probably just a normal person living the life of a musician/cheerleader, then her entire history was erased in a matter of days. The reason this happened was probably so the state could mold her to be whoever they wanted or needed at the time, which is pretty messed up. But this isn't really a surprising move for the dictatorship that loves to control and censor every aspect of their citizens' lives. The North Korean government has even gone so far as confiscating bootleg CDs of Ri Sol-ju's performances whenever they come across one. It's scary to think about what happens to the people who were in possession of those bootlegs at the time. The fact that North Korean leaders want to destroy the CDs and all other aspects of Ri Sol-ju's past so badly likely means anyone caught with one of those bootleg CDs probably doesn't make it out of the confrontation unharmed. It's not out of the realm of possibility that anyone in North Korea found with a bootleg copy of Ri's performances is either immediately thrown in jail or killed. Interestingly, Ri was not only a talented entertainer, but she also was reportedly working toward a PhD in one of the sciences before her true identity was wiped from all records and she became Kim Jong-un's wife. It seems as if she had a bright future ahead of her, even under the oppressive regime in North Korea. However, her life was about to change forever. You would think that something as important as Kim Jong-un getting married would be televised and talked about across media outlets in North Korea. Surprisingly, this was not the case, and the reason why is almost unbelievable. Not only was the wedding kept out of the media, but the exact date that Kim Jong-un and Ri Sol-ju were married is unknown. In fact, other than official statements by the government, there's no record that the wedding actually ever happened. It seems like it'd be way too much trouble to create a false marriage to give Kim Jong-un a fake wife, but you can never be too sure when it comes to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. 2009 is the best guess researchers have as to when the wedding officially took place. However, other conflicting stories say that Kim Jong-un didn't even meet Ri until 2010 at one of the concerts she was singing in. Either way, the name Ri Sol-ju did not exist until 2012, when she appeared with the supreme leader to open an amusement park and was identified as the wife of Kim Jong-un. Many claim it's not super surprising that there was secrecy around the wedding. This is because Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, did not publicize any of his weddings, even though he had multiple. Not only did Kim Jong-il not allow his weddings to be put in the spotlight, but he never even acknowledged any of his wives in public at all. It was like they existed but were not important enough to attend events or travel with the dictator. This is a pretty messed up way of treating your significant other, and Kim Jong-un is only slightly better than his father in that respect. Ri Sol-ju has definitely been seen in public more than any of Kim Jong-il's wives, but she does tend to disappear from time to time. There's something even crazier about the marriage between Kim Jong-un and Ri Sol-ju. There is a decent chance that she had no say in the marriage at all. It was reported that as Kim Jong-il got sicker and sicker, he began to panic that his son had not yet married or fathered any children. It would be a disaster if his death meant the end of the bloodline. Therefore, there was only one thing to do. Some believe that Kim Jong-il arranged the marriage after suffering a stroke in 2008. For whatever reason, the former supreme leader felt his son was not to be trusted with his own future. To be fair, Kim Jong-un hadn't had to make many decisions for himself in his life, so why would who he married be any different? The way this series of events may have played out is that with his failing health, Kim Jong-il frantically began looking for a suitable wife for his son. He found that companion through one of his military advisors, who was the uncle of Ri Sol-ju. This is unconfirmed, but it might have been the path that led to the selection of Kim Jong-un's wife. It would also explain the quick turnaround time between Kim Jong-un having no romantic partners in 2009 to being married in 2012 without anyone knowing. And this also brings up one of the wildest facts about Ri Sol-ju's life. Even though she may have had a bright future ahead of her as an entertainer or a scientist, that was all taken away in the blink of an eye by her future father-in-law. Once Kim Jong-il had his sights set on getting his son married, whoever he chose would have no choice but to say yes. There are definitely upsides to being the dictator's wife, especially when he's an absolute ruler over an entire country. But there are also several downsides. The little we know about Ri Sol-ju is just the tip of the iceberg. You have to remember that before marrying the supreme leader, she had a whole life with family and friends. The sad part is she'll likely never see any of them ever again. Being the wife of a dictator means that Ri must be protected at all times and always monitored to make sure she doesn't do anything to hurt her husband or the country as a whole. This means that Ri has zero privacy and isn't allowed to talk with family or friends without the supervision of someone from the state. We doubt she's allowed to talk with anyone from her school, music, or cheerleading days, as the North Korean government has tried extremely hard to hide everything from Ri's past. For what it's worth, Ri Sol-ju has made strides in what the wife of the supreme leader of North Korea can do. Unlike all the wives of Kim Jong-il, Ri has traveled with her husband to different countries for certain events. She's even attended some very unexpected weapons tests. In April of 2018, Ri Sol-ju became the first wife of a North Korean leader to attend a summit. Kim Jong-un and his wife went to South Korea, where they met with the president and first lady. This was a huge step forward for the wife of a supreme leader. But what made this trip so special was that it was not with a North Korean ally. Ri Sol-ju had been to China before with her husband. However, South Korea was a country where tensions tend to be high. This inter-Korean summit was a way to show peoples of each nation in the world that South and North Korea were working on a diplomatic way to get along. Ri also did something else surprising at the summit, something no one saw coming. Ri Sol-ju and Kim Jong-suk, the wife of the president of South Korea, apparently became friends. This could have just been for show, but multiple times during the visit, the two women were seen talking about various topics and laughing with one another. It was reported that they bonded over their love of music, especially singing. Kim Jong-suk sang in the Seoul Metropolitan Chorus, while Ri, as far as we can tell, sang in the Unhasu Orchestra in her pre-marriage days. It is possible that the first ladies at the summit made more progress than their husbands, and Ri Sol-ju played a prominent role in this connection during the meeting. This is a common theme with Ri, which makes it surprising when she disappears from the public view from time to time. In all of her international appearances, people seem to like her. But there's one thing about Ri Sol-ju that has surprised, shocked, and even led to confrontation amongst the international community. Ri Sol-ju has been praised and condemned for her sense of fashion, and there is a good reason for this. Ri became somewhat of a fashion icon in China. During a 2-day visit to Beijing, Ri was reported to have worn 3 different outfits, each of which became popular amongst the Chinese fashion community. She seems to favor pastel-colored dresses reminiscent of Easter eggs, which seems to speak to some Chinese women. In fact, social media in China could not get enough of the North Korean dictator's wife while she was visiting. Ri has also been seen carrying expensive bags from fashion icons like Chanel and Dior. Between the dresses, jackets, and the bags in her wardrobe, it's clear Ri Sol-ju has some expensive tastes. And this is where she runs into some problems from the international community. Ri's outfits and accessories cost thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. And this is just what we have seen from the approved media photos. There's no telling how much her entire wardrobe could cost. And in a country where poverty runs rampant among most of its citizens, having the dictator's wife owning thousands or even millions of dollars worth of clothing and accessories is not received well by human rights organizations. Now, Ri Sol-ju is not the only first lady to own expensive outfits while her people starve. Actually, any first lady in any country probably has outfits worth more than many people make in a month or a year. And this is just the world we live in. But in North Korea's case, the disparity between the people in power and the rest of the population is insane. Due to the way the country is run, somewhere around 60% of the North Korean population is reported to live in poverty. That means over half of the country is struggling just to survive, while the elites are living lives of luxury and comfort. It's almost a slap in the face to the country's citizens when the wife of their ruler is seen wearing expensive clothing. To put this into perspective, most North Korean workers make somewhere between $2 and $3 per month. That means that just one of the purses or dresses that Ri has been seen wearing costs more than what these people make in decades. That is pretty messed up when you think about it. However, we don't know for sure what the exact purchasing habits of the Supreme Leader's wife are, since the only information we have is what the state-controlled media shows us. Maybe Ri is trying to update the look of North Korea by wearing things from Western countries and promoting a more modern wardrobe for women. It seems unlikely that the men who make up the leadership of North Korea would concern themselves over what the wife of their leader wears, but maybe they do. Or perhaps the most powerful woman in North Korea, Kim Yo-jong, the sister of Kim Jong-un, is working in collaboration with Ri to change the way women are viewed in the country. We probably won't ever find out, but it is surprising that Kim Jong-un's wife is even allowed to wear clothing and apparel created by companies that are from the part of the world that North Korea despises. Even though Ri might be seen as progressive by women in some countries, she still must follow some very strict rules, some of which you will not believe. Ri Sol-ju has traveled around North Korea and to other countries with her husband many times, but she is not allowed to go anywhere on her own. Maybe it's because North Korea thinks she's a flight risk, or perhaps they don't trust her, but it's more likely because they just want to control every part of her life. Until Ri Sol-ju, the wives of the supreme leaders of North Korea weren't allowed to leave the country even with their husbands. So at least Ri getting to visit China and South Korea is positive. But the restrictions Ri has to follow are extreme at the best of times and oppressive in most circumstances. Interestingly, Ri left the country many times before being married when she traveled as an entertainer. But now that she's Kim Jong-un's wife, traveling outside of North Korea by herself is a thing of the past. However, one of the most shocking places that Ri Sol-ju has been spotted is at a missile launch. Why does she need to be at missile launches? No one knows. Maybe it has to do with Kim Jong-un wanting his faithful wife by his side as he threatens world peace, but it probably has more to do with public image than anything else. Then again, maybe Ri enjoys going to the missile launches. She always seems to have one of her most stylish pastel dresses on for the occasion. Since she's not allowed to do interviews or speak for herself, we may never know why she's actually there. But a missile launch seems to be an odd place for the First Lady to appear, even in North Korea. And this isn't the only military activity that Ri's been involved with. She was actually responsible for something that seems to be out of line with how the wives of the Kim dynasty are normally treated. It's almost unbelievable. It's been reported that Ri Sol-ju actually fired one of the top generals in the North Korean military. There's a decent chance this was done as a way to advance a particular policy change or a form of propaganda to show the supreme leader's wife as being powerful, but it's still the first time such an event has occurred. Although, when you think about it, it's kind of a badass move for Ri to fire a hardened general. Seems that for many years, Ri could be found by her husband's side at any number of different events and occasions. However, there are times when the supreme leader's wife went missing. What could have caused her sudden disappearance? You wouldn't know it, but it was actually for a joyous reason. At least that's what it seemed like at first. Although the international community didn't learn of who Ri Sol-ju was until 2012, there were North Koreans who were aware their future leader had taken a wife years before that. Some recounted that in 2010, Ri Sol-ju abruptly disappeared. It got to the point where people were worried about her well-being. Rumors started to circulate that she'd become very sick. However, that was far from the truth. What actually happened during her disappearance was that she was pregnant. The North Korean government did not want Ri to appear in any form of media until after she had given birth. No one quite knows why they wanted to keep Ri and her pregnancy a secret from the world, but the second time around in 2012, many speculated based on pictures that she was pregnant again. The craziest part was that the world wouldn't find out if the rumors were true until a former NBA player went to North Korea and accidentally leaked the secret. In 2013, Dennis Rodman visited Kim Jong-un in North Korea. This would be the first of several visits to the country where he became friends with the supreme leader. When Rodman first met Kim Jong-un, he said he got to spend time with his family. This would be one of the only times when someone from the United States or Western world would interact with Ri Sol-ju. When Rodman returned from his visit to North Korea, he had only nice things to say about Kim Jong-un and his wife. Rodman told the press that Ri was kind and that Kim Jong-un was a good dad with a beautiful family. Their baby girl is named Kim Ju-ae and was apparently the only child present when Rodman visited North Korea. This is interesting because although Rodman has been back, there has been no mention of Kim Jong-un and Ri's other kids. They're reported to have 3 altogether, but this cannot be confirmed as there's no official pictures or documents of the children. In 2017, Ri disappeared again, and it's assumed she had another child. But this is where things get really crazy. There might be a reason that Ri Sol-ju and the rest of the family of the Supreme Leader have not been in the press. In order to continue the Kim dynasty, Ri and her husband need to have a boy. Some reports claim that this has already happened, but others are skeptical. Media outlets in South Korea have speculated that Ri Sol-ju's first 2 children were girls. This would be a problem for the Kim dynasty, as a male is needed to continue the family tradition of ruling North Korea. Some think this prompted North Korean officials to force Ri and her husband to keep trying until they had a baby boy. One defector even told South Korean newscasters that Ri was being pressured from all sides to give birth to a son because the regime is not so sturdy. This is a good time to point out the irony of male dictators or kings who get upset at their wives for not having a male baby. Since the only way a baby can be born is if the father's Y chromosome is in the sperm that impregnates the female. The only person to blame for not having a boy is the father. This means that it's never the woman's fault that a baby is not male. Granted, it is random chance whether the sperm will contain an X or a Y chromosome, but the fact remains the only person that's capable of contributing to the sex of the chromosome that will result in a male offspring is the father. So really, Kim Jong-un should be the only person under pressure to produce male offspring, and Ri Sol-ju should just be left alone. Then again, Kim doesn't seem like he takes constructive criticism very well. In April of 2018, Ri received a new title. Instead of being Comrade Ri Sol-ju, she was elevated to the status of Respected First Lady Ri Sol-ju. This was the first time the wife of a North Korean ruler has held that title since 1974. This might have been done to show that North Korea was a progressive country, but since 2018, very little has been seen of Ri Sol-ju. In fact, the last time she was seen was on January 25, 2020, at the Pyongyang Samjeon Theater for a Lunar New Year's Day performance. This means she has not made an appearance in public in almost 2 years. Like everything else about Ri Sol-ju, we have very little information to go on to explain her most recent disappearance. But you can't help but feel that the leaders of the North Korean government are in some way to blame. 2 teenagers wake up in North Korea. One is the son of a high-ranking North Korean government official. The other is the son of an average citizen. Over the next 24 hours, their lives couldn't possibly be more different. The first teen wakes up in a luxurious apartment located in one of Pyongyang's newest high-rises. His father is a high-ranking official amongst the North Korean government, but not amongst the top 10% within the party who control nearly all the power and wealth in the nation. Still, by any standards, even Western ones, his father is very wealthy. And by North Korean standards, his family is among the richest in the nation. However, wealth isn't the only way to power in North Korea. And while his father is a rising star in the government, he still hasn't earned the privilege of living in the most wealthy residential districts of the capital city. For breakfast, our teen has his pick of a variety of foods. He could choose to have a traditional Korean breakfast which sort of resembles Spanish tapas. A variety of dishes which include grilled short ribs, spicy seafood salad, bean sprout rice, spicy stewed fish, cold cucumber soup, seasoned kelp, and radish strip kimchi. His family's kitchen staff has already made itself available by 5 a.m. to be ready to serve, given that his father often has to be at work by 6 a.m. Our teen is woken up at a modest 8 a.m. though. Despite his wealth, he is very much being groomed to join the halls of North Korean power and work his way up the ranks to hopefully surpass his father. That means that unlike most other wealthy North Korean kids, there's immense pressure on him and he's constantly scrutinized by party officials for any sign of weakness. Despite not having school today, sleeping in too late would be seen as a sign of laziness, and there's a good chance at least one member of the household staff is secretly spying on the family for more senior party officials. One must always have their guard up, even in their own home. Instead of traditional Korean breakfast, our teen opts for an American classic, Smacks. It's authentic Smacks cereal too, complete with the cartoon frog. While you'd be extremely hard-pressed to find legit American products anywhere else in the country, our teen's father is important enough to be able to access goods smuggled into North Korea through its various government-sponsored black market programs. Smacks cereal, Pop-Tarts, and other American treats are a favorite amongst North Korea's elite and a sign of status. Our second teen has already been awake for hours. He got up at 4 a.m. along with his father so they could both find a ride into the city. He lives on the outskirts of Pyongyang, and this is considered a privilege. This teen lives in one of a row of squat concrete homes built on the outskirts of the capital. His family has few belongings, and he shares a large sleeping mat in his room with his younger brother. The family doesn't own a car, and there's no formal public transportation on the extreme outskirts of the city, so the teen and his father must rise early to secure themselves a spot in a large utility van owned by another local. In exchange for ferrying as many people as he can fit into his van into the city, the man gets the equivalent of 75 cents per passenger. This is about 1/6 of what his father will earn today, but there's no other choice. In the evening, he and his father will likely be forced to make the 3-hour walk home. Despite the relative poverty our second teen lives in, his family is extremely lucky. Here on the outskirts of the capital city, his father is able to commute into the city and get a job as a doorman at one of the luxury apartment buildings. When his father was a teenager, such a thing would have been unthinkable, as the luxury apartment buildings were extremely scarce. Today, though, despite tough international sanctions, the North Korean economy has slightly improved. And while most of the benefit is for those at the very top, some of that wealth has trickled down to the rest. For those living outside of a major city, though, daily hunger and abject poverty are a continued reality. Our second teen is extremely lucky, and his parents make sure to tell him every day. Our second teen hopes to also secure a job as a doorman. He's only 15, but that's old enough to work in North Korea. He could opt to go to school, but entry into North Korean universities is all but impossible without the right connections or wealth. Most slots for new students are immediately taken up by the children of North Korea's elite. Just to earn a spot, one has to have exceptional school grades and then be nominated by a local college recommendation committee. If cleared by the committee, the applicant must then be approved by subsequent county and provincial level committees. Our teen was a good student, but the sheer number of hurdles to jump through to get to a university means he's more likely to make a living for himself by finding work in the city. He dreams of a doorman job or perhaps even getting accepted to work at one of the city's factories. For now, though, he hires himself out as a general laborer, picking up trash or sometimes even helping out at construction sites. If he's lucky, he may get a job as a builder, and the government might send him to work overseas. These types of contracts are common in construction across the Middle East and Asia, with North Korean laborers hired out by the government to construction companies. The government keeps most of what the contract is worth, but he can make as much as several dollars a day, a very good deal for him, even if the work conditions are often extremely brutal and tantamount to slave labor, as foreign companies can be extremely abusive to their North Korean laborers. Our first teen has finished his breakfast and has an hour to kill before his cultural enrichment classes begin. It's a Saturday, so he doesn't have to attend Kim Il-sung University, where he's majoring in finance. Kim Il-sung University is the country's premier institution of higher learning, and admissions are extremely competitive. Only 1 in 6 applicants are accepted, and recommendations have to be ironclad. Luckily for our teen, his father has the right connections and the wealth to make the appropriate bribes. Despite not having official schooling today, he still takes various arts classes outside of his university requirements. Achieving status and power amongst North Korean elite is a careful game, and one must give off the appearance of being well-rounded, as well as having fierce dedication to the Kim regime. Thus, our teen takes a few hours of art classes on the weekends. He dresses in some of the West's latest fashions, yet another sign of his status. Most well-to-do North Koreans will be a season or two behind in fashion, as it's difficult to get items from Western markets into the nation. However, only the most elite remain on top of fashion trends and proudly display the fact as a status symbol. He also catches a bit of Western television. While the rest of the nation only enjoys North Korean government-sponsored programming and international communications and television are strictly banned, a perk of power is access to satellite television. Even just to access the regular internet, one has to have special permission from the government, while the rest of the nation enjoys a nationwide intranet run completely by the government. Our teen has enough time for 1 half-hour TV show before it's time to leave. He dislikes the plethora of Chinese TV channels available to him, all of them also heavily censored by their own government, and instead appreciates the uncensored content from Europe and the USA. One day, he might even continue his studies abroad, and he hopes to go to the United States to continue his education. Given the relationship between the two countries, it seems impossible, but his father has the connections to get him fake Chinese documents that should fool US Customs. Riding an elevator down to the lobby, a shiny new Mercedes and a driver are waiting to take him to his art class. The Mercedes is very luxurious, but a few years old, a sign that his father isn't yet among the top 1% of North Korean society, but very close nonetheless. These luxury vehicles are prohibited from being exported to the Hermit Kingdom, but the government has ways of smuggling them anyway, and owning a current-year luxury vehicle is the ultimate sign of power and status. Hopping into the air-conditioned vehicle, he's whisked away in total comfort for his 1-hour art class. A few blocks away, our second teen and his father have finally arrived at the city center. His father has to hurry to work. He's risking running late and losing his job, but the van has made more stops today than anticipated. He says goodbye to his father and heads in the opposite direction, looking for any public workers or construction sites who may need an extra hand for the day. If he finds nothing, he'll keep looking for the next 14 hours until his father is off work and the two head back home. He has no lunch money with him. He won't eat until he gets home tonight. The only meal he had before leaving home was some rice, soybean paste, and a few vegetables. Compared with people in the country, he's eating extremely well. Our first teen wraps up his art class. His teacher's from France, one of the few foreigners allowed into the country, let alone to teach. In return, he's paid extremely well, which makes his classes very expensive. Yet another sign of our teen's status. He sends a text to some friends over his cell phone. Cell phones were once banned in the country after an alleged assassination attempt on the Kim family, but those restrictions have been relaxed. Now you can enjoy 3G service, though again with no international internet, since the cell service is run by the government-controlled communications company. Koryo Link is the fastest service available, though Kumsan has larger coverage even if it's only 2G. Our first teen and his friends agree to meet up for lunch and drinks at the Taedonggang Brewery, famous for making domestic North Korean beer. Normally, one would have to make reservations, but our teen's father and the fathers of his friends are known to the brewery staff, and one phone call is all it takes to clear them for a table for lunch. The legal drinking age in North Korea is 18, but most places don't bother with enforcing that, despite some of our teen's friends only being 16 years old and none of the staff saying a word. And they wouldn't dare question the son or daughter of a high-ranking official anyway. Once there, they're served by pretty waitresses in form-fitting pink uniforms. At North Korea's elite social spots, a strong emphasis is placed on the wait and serving staff being attractive, fit, and young. Once a server ages out, they're replaced by a new, younger member. Being pretty and fit in North Korea's major cities can offer many opportunities to young women not available elsewhere. But those opportunities are often rife with abuse. The teens drink and eat, ordering Western fare such as burgers and even burritos. Enjoying American foods is yet another sign of privilege, and a growing number of establishments in major cities are pairing traditional Korean fare with American and Western dishes. Despite being allowed to drink, none of the teens drink to excess, as they're always under close scrutiny. Any major public incident could spell doom, not just for them, but their father's political futures as well. After lunch, the teens are driven to one of Pyongyang's amusement centers, featuring flashy arcades and even some carnival-style rides. There, they enjoy themselves playing North Korean versions of popular Western arcade games, but many are either blatantly pirated copies or simply smuggled into the country. A Led Zeppelin pinball machine sits next to a Jurassic World shooting simulator, and a bevy of treats and sugary drinks, both traditional and Western, are available to the teens. As the day grinds down, our teen returns home just in time to catch his father also arriving. The two take the elevator up and discuss their relative days, before entering the home to be greeted by their mother, who's already supervised the house staff in the preparation of a delicious meal. Tonight, dinner will be traditional with a Western-style twist. Braised short ribs and kimchi accompany a meaty beef lasagna dish. The family isn't stingy though, and what they don't eat, the house staff will take home to their families. These leftovers are still significantly more meat than the average North Korean will eat in a month. Our second teen's day is also coming to an end. He spent the entire morning until noon desperately looking for work, until finally he got lucky, and a construction site offered him work for the day. For 7 hours, he lugged heavy bricks up and down scaffolding, being allowed to rest only when there was a lull in the work. His hard work has paid off though, and despite being only 16, the foreman said he would consider the boy for an overseas job assignment. If he's lucky enough to receive it, he'll likely end up working in the exploding cities in the Middle East, where he'll work in 105+ degree weather with few breaks. The local management is known to be extremely abusive to their North Korean workers, doling out physical punishments as they see fit. After a 14 to 16-hour workday, he'll be immediately herded to a shared living quarter. Government minders will oversee his entire stay and not allow him any contact with the local population. For his work, he'll get an average salary of $12 a day, though the government will take at least half of that. Still, this would be an incredible opportunity for our teen as he and his father begin their 3-hour walk home. He looks with optimism toward his future. Kim Jong-un says both the US and South Korea should be thoroughly annihilated, as he claims that America and its allies have made unprecedented moves in 2023 that have pushed the Korean peninsula to the brink of war. Of course, that claim came with the qualifier that this annihilation would occur only if the US and South Korea provoked Pyongyang. But the message from Kim Jong-un is clear. I'm ready to fight, and if need be, push the nuclear button to safeguard North Korea's security. As Kim puts it, North Korea has to sharpen the treasured sword so that it's ready to stab and slice at will should the country ever go to war with the US or South Korea. All of this leads to an obvious question: who would win if South Korea and North Korea locked treasured swords in 2024? To answer that question, we start with the most obvious comparison: direct military strength. For years now, North Korea has been strengthening its military to the point where it could be a severe threat to its biggest rival. And with annihilation on the horizon, the potential of war between North and South Korea is higher than it's been in decades. The news that North Korea is ready to strike, reported on January 1st, comes amidst expectations that the country is going to conduct a higher number of weapon tests in 2024 than at any other point in its history. According to Sky News, Kim seems to believe that strengthening North Korea's nuclear arsenal will give him leverage to gain concessions from the U.S. should Donald Trump be elected president again. But if we take the nukes out of the equation for a moment, we're left with a comparison of conventional military strength. Across the DMZ, North Korea's more democratic twin has also been preparing for war. According to Global Firepower, South Korea has one of the world's strongest militaries. It ranks number 6 in its list of 145 countries for pure military power, with South Korea having a power index score of 0.1505. For context, Global Firepower considers a score of 0.0000 to be perfect. North Korea isn't a slouch in military power, but it doesn't quite compare to its neighbor to the south. Global Firepower ranks it as the 34th strongest military nation in the world, with a power index score of 0.5118. That alone would suggest that South Korea would come out on top in a direct fight between the two, at least if only conventional weapons were used. However, we need to dive deeper to see how the country's military stack up against one another. We'll start with sheer manpower. Surprisingly, North Korea comes out on top when it comes to the number of active military personnel. It has 1.2 million active members compared to South Korea's 555,000, with its paramilitary forces also being stronger. They number at 200,000, with South Korea only having 75,000. Though it's worth pointing out that paramilitary forces aren't officially recognized as a part of a nation's military. Thus, they're less predictable and perhaps more prone to following their own path rather than any official orders. On the reserve front, the countries are comparable, with North Korea having 600,000 reserves to South Korea's 500,000. Still, North Korea seems to have more manpower until you remember one thing. Both countries have national conscription programs. According to a South Korean general named I.B. Chun, in an interview with Policy Exchange, men serve in the North Korean military for at least 11 years, with women serving for between 6 and 7. By contrast, South Korea's mandatory military service lasts for between 18 and 21 months, with the service being limited to physically fit men aged between 18 and 35. Typically, these men can also choose when they want to complete their service. Again, it seems like North Korea comes out on top because it has a longer conscription period, which may also account for why it has more active military personnel. But Global Firepower stats suggest the numbers may be misleading. It says that South Korea has nearly 26 million people who could potentially fight in its military, while North Korea has only 9.3 million and change. If war were to break out, South Korea has millions more people it could call upon, many of them already trained to fight against North Korean forces. So, there are two sides to the manpower story. North Korea has more active personnel, whereas South Korea has more available manpower should it need to strengthen its army at short notice. That latter point is demonstrated by Global Firepower, pointing out that the South has 21.2 million people who are fit for service compared to North Korea's 5.2 million. The North may have more people in its army right now, but that could change quickly if South Korea requires more manpower. It's also worth looking at each country's military budget. After all, spending affects how many soldiers a country might have, as well as the quality of their equipment. And in this department, South Korea is the clear victor. Global Firepower estimates that South Korea spends about $42 billion per year on its military, a number that's backed by Statista, though it places the estimate close to $40 billion. North Korea spends about a tenth of that, with an annual budget of $4.5 billion, though this may increase slightly in 2024. South Korea has more cash to splash, and when you compare the country's purchasing powers, nearly $2.1 trillion for South Korea compared to $38.5 billion for North Korea, it is clear the South could easily ramp up its military spending even more if needed. North Korea may not have that option, but when North Korea spends, it at least seems to be able to spend somewhat wisely, which brings us into an examination of air power, stacking the Korean People's Army's Air Force (KPAF) against the South's Republic of Korea Air Force or ROKAF throws out some interesting numbers. South comes out on top in terms of the number of aerial assets, as it has 1,602 aircraft to the North's 947. But interestingly, the North has 56 more fighter planes. perhaps suggesting it would anticipate a lot more aerial dogfighting to take place in a war with South Korea. It's with supporting aircraft that North Korea falls. It has only one transport craft compared to the South's 41, and South Korea also has aerial tankers and special mission craft that the KPAF doesn't have. Add to all that South Korea's much more impressive fleet of helicopters, 600 more than the North, split between standard and attack choppers, and odds are high that the South would reign supreme in an aerial battle. But what about a fight on land? North Korea has a few victories in that department. It has 6,645 tanks compared to South Korea's 2,331, and about 2,000 more self-propelled artillery, also called locomotive artillery, that's capable of using inbuilt propulsion systems to get closer to a target before firing. North Korea also ranks third in the world for mobile rocket projectors, with 2,920 compared to 581 held by the 12th-ranked South Korea. Yet, North Korea doesn't have clear land dominance. When it comes to armored vehicles, the South is the clear victor, as it has over 133,000 compared to the North's 39,000. That matters because it means South Korea has more vehicles that are capable of getting troops into North Korea relatively safely, meaning the South is better positioned to launch a land-borne invasion. South Korea also has about 676 more towed artillery units, though the difference is negligible in comparison to the armored vehicle issue. As for terrain, both countries are covered in hills and mountains. Korea.net says that 3/4 of South Korea is mountainous, with North Korea's geography being somewhat similar. That's good news for the South. It's much easier to negotiate hilly terrain in smaller armored vehicles than it is in cumbersome and bulky tanks. South Korea has traded pure strength for enhanced agility, which may give it an edge on the ground. But how do the two countries stack up if we take the battle to the seas? According to Global Firepower, North and South Korea are pretty much equivalent when it comes to coastline coverage. The South has almost 1,500 miles of coverage compared to the North's 1,550 miles. So both would consider naval attacks in addition to having to safeguard their coasts against the other. And in that seaborne battle, North Korea finally appears to come out on top. Global Firepower says it has the third largest naval fleet in the world, with 519 vessels compared to the 157 South Korea has. North Korea also has more submarines, 35 to 22, and over 4 times the number of patrol vessels South Korea has. Where the South comes out on top is its destroyers, frigates, and corvettes, as it has more than North Korea in all of those departments. Those ships have more firepower than North Korea's patrol boats, meaning a naval battle would come down to the North's pure numbers versus the South's strength. Throw submarines into the mix, and South Korea may find that its northern rival can scupper some of the larger ships before they can make ground or be effective in deeper waters. Nevertheless, a potentially stronger navy doesn't mean that North and South Korea are evenly matched on the conventional front. Yes, the North has more vessels and more active military personnel, but South Korea comes out on top in spending, air assets, and ground units. Additionally, the personnel numbers are deceiving. North Korea may have more people actively serving in its military, but South Korea's conscription means it has more people who are fit for service and can be called upon if a war between the countries starts. If it was simply a case of South Korea versus North Korea, the South would likely win. But this fight wouldn't be so simple. Both countries have allies who may not only support them, but have a vested interest in helping their allied country maintain or expand its power. However, the nature of those two alliances differs, with some being more overt, while others have tensions hidden behind them that could render them moot in the case of a Korean War. Starting with South Korea, it just so happens to be allied with the world's strongest military nation, the United States. In July 2023, South Korea and the U.S. celebrated their 70th anniversary of working together. The Mutual Defense Treaty the two countries signed in 1953 is still in full effect, to the point where the U.S. Department of Defense can claim to have over 28,000 American troops stationed in the Korean Peninsula. That alliance is underpinned by 3 crucial words: "We go together." These words are an explicit statement of intent, meaning that the U.S. will support South Korea in its wars, just as South Korea will support the U.S. The alliance traces its creation to the Korean War. In June 1950, North Korean troops, supported by Russia and China, marched across the 38th parallel, which is the line of demarcation that separates South Korea from its northern neighbor. In response to this act of aggression, the United Nations, or UN, gathered a multinational force to support South Korea. Most members of that force were American soldiers. Over the 3 years of fighting that followed, the U.S. sent hundreds of thousands of troops to South Korea. Over 33,000 of those troops never returned home. and of those who did, 103,000 were wounded. When the war ended in July 1953, the US and South Korea had an alliance forged from fighting together that was made official by the Mutual Defense Treaty the country signed that same year that the war ended. To this day, the United States is South Korea's largest defense partner, but it's not the only partner that South Korea has. Though Japan and South Korea have long experienced roadblocks that prevented them from forging a true military relationship, those obstacles have cleared in recent years. Throughout the 2020s, South Korea has conducted trilateral military drills and training exercises with Japan and the US, meaning Seoul and Tokyo have stronger links than they've had in years. Those links are born as much out of the threat that China presents to both countries than the danger of North Korean aggressions. However, that isn't to say that Japan isn't a North Korean target. In July 2023, The Guardian reported on a North Korean ballistic missile test that saw one of its missiles crash down just 155 miles from Okushiri Island. The launch was apparently in retaliation to the threat of US spy plane flights over North Korea, though Kim Jong-un might have miscalculated by targeting Japan. While he tried to display the advancements that North Korea had made in missile development, Japan obviously experienced alarm over just how close that missile had come to its territory. The bonds between the US, Japan, and South Korea strengthened as a result. Suddenly, South Korea's disputes with Japan over its past occupation of the country seemed much smaller, as did arguments over the names of stretches of water and the ownership of a handful of disputed islets. North Korea along with China have established themselves as mutual enemies, meaning South Korea can rely on Japan for military aid if no other reason than the fall of South Korea would endanger Japan as well. All of this is bad news for North Korea. If it went to war with South Korea, it would face additional threats from the US and Japan. On top of this, wherever the US fights, much of the Western world is likely to follow. Even if South Korea didn't receive direct military support from the West, it would likely be able to rely on money and equipment provided by countries that don't want to see North Korea expand its power. Of course, North Korea wouldn't be alone in this fight. It has alliances too, though none that could be considered as sturdy as those that South Korea shares with the US and Japan. Take its alliance with China as an example. In 1961, North Korea signed the Mutual Aid Cooperation Friendship Treaty with China, which still stands as the only cooperative treaty that China has signed with any country. In 2021, the Lowy Institute reported that the countries had renewed this treaty for another 20 years, meaning they'll be cooperating until at least 2041. And on the surface, that alliance seems strong. So strong that former Chinese leader Mao Zedong once described the two countries as being as close as lips and teeth. So North Korea would be able to rely on China for help in a war with South Korea, right? Not necessarily. Though Beijing is outwardly aligned with Pyongyang, China has a history of not cooperating with North Korea as much as North Korea would like. According to the Rand Corporation, China hasn't provided any assistance to North Korea in the development of the latter's nuclear weapons, likely fearing what North Korean aggression fueled by nukes would mean for China's influence in Asia. That wariness stretches far enough for China to offer restrained support for the UN Security Council and its sanctions against Pyongyang's nuclear weapon tests. There's clear self-interest at play here. For its part, North Korea hasn't always been a sturdy ally to China either. Kim Jong-un's execution of Jang Song-taek, Kim's own uncle, and an important contributor to the dialogue between the two countries, angered Beijing. Additionally, Rand reports that North Korean escapees often say Japan is our enemy of 100 years, China is our enemy of 1,000 years. So where America's support of South Korea appears absolute, China's support of North Korea may come with conditions. There are tensions between the countries, meaning China is unlikely to act directly on North Korea's behalf unless it is certain that the situation benefits it as much or more than it benefits North Korea. Then there's Russia. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS, there's been a surge of activity between North Korea and Russia that suggests the two countries are strengthening their ties. For instance, a summit held between Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin in September 2023 attracted worldwide attention, with the US claiming that Pyongyang sent 1,000 containers of military equipment to Russia just days before that meeting. Furthermore, this was the fifth such shipment North Korea had sent from August 2023, with satellite images of the shipments also showing they're reciprocal in nature. North Korea sends equipment to Russia, Russia sends shipments back. But don't let those shipments fool you. There's no official alliance or treaty between Moscow and Pyongyang. With their current relationship seeming to be born out of self-interest on both sides, rather than a true desire to work together. Tensions are still high, and though some commentators believe that a trilateral alliance between North Korea, China, and Russia is in the making, the IISS says it's unlikely Russia or China would support North Korea in a renewed war on the Korean Peninsula. The stakes are much higher, especially with nuclear weapons now being in the equation, and neither country would want to harm its own interests by supporting North Korean aggression. If that's the case, North Korea doesn't really have any strong allies on which it can rely. The best it could hope for would be lip service from Russia and China, combined with potential work alongside Iran-aligned militias, as reported by Stimson in October 2023. That won't be enough to overcome South Korea's allegiances. So South Korea has the edge in manpower and has much stronger alliances to call upon. It's also not likely to be the aggressor of the two nations, which works against North Korea because its aggression would make its current partners wary of a larger war. Nevertheless, there's still one advantage North Korea would bring to the fight against South Korea. Pyongyang doesn't play by the rules. According to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, North Korea is one of the only 4 countries that hasn't ratified the Chemical Weapons Convention, or CWC, created by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The only others are Egypt, South Sudan, and surprisingly Israel. South Korea has ratified the CWC and is committed to not using lethal chemical weapons in a war. As for North Korea, it won't officially say that it has chemical weapons, but according to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, NTI, there's almost no chance it doesn't have them. The NTI says North Korea started seeking out these types of weapons in 1954, 1 year after its failed invasion of South Korea, and that it developed the ability to produce them internally at some point during the 1980s. Since then, Pyongyang has focused on developing stockpiles of some of the most lethal chemical agents in the world, including phosgene, sarin, and mustard gas, along with V-type chemical agents that can cause seizures, muscle spasms, and a host of other dangerous symptoms. Just a few milligrams of this dangerous substance can be fatal to a human. The NTI also says that some North Korean defectors claim that prisoners and those with disabilities are used as test subjects for these chemical weapons. Furthermore, the assassination of Kim Jong-nam, Kim Jong-un's half-brother, and a potential political competitor, was carried out by North Korean spies using the VX nerve agent. And that's not all. According to the NTI, a 2018 defense white paper published by South Korea claimed that North Korea had between 2,500 and 5,000 tons of chemical weapons agents, more than enough to cripple South Korea, given that just a few milligrams of one of these agents can result in death or debilitation. Of course, North Korea using these types of weapons would bring global condemnation. But if Kim Jong-un had gotten to the point where he'd declared open war on South Korea, it's unlikely he would care about other countries being upset about his use of such dangerous chemicals. And finally, there's the nuclear program. South Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons. Its people want them. The Wilson Center says that 71% of South Koreans support the return of nukes to their country, but Seoul hasn't built any yet. In April 2023, the BBC reported on the clandestine first meeting of an organization called the Forum for Nuclear Strategy. Made up of South Korean scientists, politicians, and military members, the forum supposedly exists to plot a course towards South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons. The result for this forum's existence is obvious. North Korea is openly working toward building independent nuclear capabilities of its own. And it seems to be drawing ever closer to developing full nuclear capabilities. In September 2021, Pyongyang claimed to have successfully tested a cruise missile that hit a target 930 miles from its launch point. That announcement triggered ballistic missile tests by both North and South Korea, with both essentially proving that they could launch missiles at each other. They would just need nukes to add to those missiles. Right now, North Korea seems closer than South Korea to achieving its nuclear goals. According to the NTI, the US government believes that Pyongyang is able to produce enriched uranium and plutonium, with an estimate from 2017 stating that North Korea likely has enough of these materials to produce at least 12 nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-un may talk about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but his actions don't align with his words. And of all the world's leaders, he seems to be the one who's willing to show so much aggression that he'd go down the nuclear route should war erupt between North and South Korea. So, who would win this fight? Do you think that South Korea's stronger conventional forces combined with its alliances would be enough to overcome the North's aggression? Or does Kim Jong-un's potential willingness to use chemical and nuclear weapons means that he has aces in the hole that would guarantee a North Korean victory? Ukraine is now a test site for North Korean nuclear-capable missiles. That's the beyond alarming conclusion Jong, the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea to the United Nations, and his envoy made public at the UN Security Council on Wednesday, January 10, 2024. Of course, this conclusion came as no surprise to the U.S. officials, as the White House had already found that the Russian forces launched at least one of the North Korean ballistic missiles into Ukraine on December 30, 2023. Fortunately, this missile appears to have landed in an open field in Zaporizhia Oblast, resulting in no casualties. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for the multiple North Korean nuclear-capable missiles used to strike Ukraine on January 2, 2024. These missiles, part of a gruesome overnight aerial mass attack, claimed the lives of 5 people, injuring 130 more. But Russia's senseless violence and acts of aggression in Ukraine are nothing new. The question is, why are North Korean missiles being used for these horrifying assaults? Could it be that the reliance on North Korean weapons shows that Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, has become increasingly isolated on the world stage, as John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesperson, puts it? Or is it North Korea using this chance for a devious goal of its own? After all, the country and its ruthless leader, Kim Jong-un, is infamous for conducting these so-called test launches of its weapons on the global stage. Of course, the goal of these isn't so much to test weapons as it is to instill fear, assert dominance, and send a clear message to the countries North Korea perceives as threats or adversaries. But why nuclear-capable weapons, and why Ukraine? Though Kim has a penchant for unpredictable and audacious moves, they're rarely without a cause. It's pretty obvious that there's a strong motive behind North Korea's involvement in Ukraine. So what kind of message is Kim sending at this time? Stick around and you'll hear this message loud and clear. But we can't just dive into the latest Kim's posturing attempt without looking to his track record of provocative actions involving weapon testing. This will help us uncover the patterns that have defined his leadership, taking us one step closer to understanding why North Korea's supreme leader wants to garner international attention in Ukraine. The latest North Korean stunt involved Pyongyang's new KN-23 and KN-24 short-range missiles, as established based on the debris recovered in Ukraine. Both of these are solid-fueled tactical ballistic missiles with the same booster, estimated to be capable of carrying a warhead up to 1,100 pounds. However, the KN-23 missile can also carry both nuclear and conventional warheads. It's this nuclear component that worries South Korea and the Western nations. After all, North Korea itself has associated previous launches of these missiles with the development of tactical nuclear weapons. This is particularly worrisome, as it could suggest Kim is gearing up to test more nuclear weapons. The most recent test of this kind, and the 6th in total, was in 2017, when North Korea tested a nuclear bomb. This explosion was carried out at the Punggiri test site and had a force of between 100 and 370 kilotons. To understand just how powerful this bomb is, try this for comparison. The yield of the bomb the US dropped on Nagasaki in 1945 was about 21 kilotons. North Korea deemed this test as a, quote, perfect success, labeling this device as the most powerful of all types of nuclear bombs. This bold claim comes from the fact that the bomb in question is a hydrogen bomb instead of an atomic bomb. The former uses fusion, the merging of atoms, to unleash unprecedented devastation, eclipsing all atomic counterparts in its display of power and peril. But besides describing this bomb as powerful beyond compare, North Korea also described it as missile-ready. The fact that this hydrogen bomb can be loaded onto long-range missiles is what amplifies its global threat, especially when you consider that since the start of 2022 alone, North Korea has test-fired more than 100 missiles, a record high for the country. Among them, there has been a variety of ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as hypersonic missiles that can fly at low altitudes to evade radar detection while moving at several times the speed of sound. However, 2023 saw the introduction of North Korea's most powerful missile to date, the Hwasong-18. This intercontinental ballistic missile first was unveiled at the February 8th parade, commemorating the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Korean People's Army. Its maiden flight would come only 2 months later, on April 13th, when it reportedly flew about 620 miles. This figure alone might seem impressive for a test flight, but the missile's actual range is what makes this device so significant and potentially concerning. Namely, Hwasong-18 is estimated to have a range of over 9,000 miles, according to the US-based Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. With this range, the entirety of the continental US lies within its potential strike zone. In comparison, previously tested Hwasong missiles could only reach certain parts of the US. For instance, the Hwasong-12 could travel up to 2,800 miles, placing the US island territory of Guam within its range. At 6,200 miles, the Hwasong-14 model more than doubled this range, making it capable of reaching New York City. But believe it or not, the increasing range of these missiles isn't even the worst part. The Hwasong-18 missile is believed to be able to carry 3 or 4 warheads rather than only one. With how devastating one North Korean bomb reportedly is, the prospect of multiple warheads raining down from a single missile casts a cataclysmic shadow over global security. For now, most missiles can only mount miniaturized nuclear warheads. But this doesn't make the threat any less ominous, as North Korea has long been planning to test out mounting these warheads on a growing range of weapons. Plus, experts believe the country already possesses dozens of miniaturized nuclear warheads that can be fitted on older systems, such as Rodong and Scud missiles. Then there's how fast North Korea progresses in developing technology. Let's just take nuclear testing as an example. As mentioned, the latest large-scale nuclear test took place in 2017. However, the blast produced by this test can't be compared to any previous magnitude and estimated yield. For instance, the test performed a mere year prior, in September 2016, only had a yield of around 10 kilotons, a fraction of the 2017 explosion. Of course, the word "only" is used very loosely in this context, as the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima was estimated at 15 kilotons. But to scale up to that level took North Korea less than a year. Only 8 months earlier, the country concluded a nuclear test in January 2016 that created a blast of approximately 6 kilotons. In that short period, North Korea almost doubled the explosive power of its bombs. Of course, compared to the 2017 numbers, these figures seem almost modest, which just goes to show the unnerving trajectory of North Korea's nuclear ambitions. That's why the country's 2018 announcement that it was done conducting nuclear tests after the 2017 success was rather suspicious. The country's supreme leader announced that the Punggye-ri nuclear test site would be closed down, even staging a closing ceremony in May 2018. But if you know anything about North Korea, the country of carefully orchestrated narratives, you'll know that using the verb stage is intentional. That's because the closing ceremony was seemingly nothing but a choreographed event, an orchestrated spectacle meant to project an image of commitment to denuclearization. In reality, no journalists from South Korea, nuclear experts, or inspectors were allowed to attend the ceremony, let alone study the supposedly closed test site at close quarters. This left the world to no alternative but believing North Korea, which claimed that the entrances of the 2 test tunnels at Punggye-ri were blown up. Though this is technically true, there's just one tiny detail missing from those reports. The tunnels themselves weren't demolished. The same goes for the other tunnels not previously used for nuclear testing. In addition, satellite images show that most of the administrative and support facilities within the Punggye-ri's 10-mile-long complex are still standing. Knowing these facts, you probably won't be surprised at the findings from the International Atomic Energy Agency's 2022 report. This report claims that North Korea has begun restoring test tunnels at Punggye-ri, but even without these tunnels, the test site remains prepared to support a nuclear test, as the agency puts it. But unfortunately, Punggye-ri isn't the only place that got a glimpse of the full force of North Korea's nuclear ambitions. So did numerous targets across South Korea when its northern neighbor conducted a simulated scorched earth nuclear strike in August 2023. This attack entailed firing 2 short-range ballistic missiles into the sea mere hours after the U.S. deployed B-1B bombers for the South Korea-U.S. combined air drills. Of course, these drills were used as a pretext for firing North Korean missiles, the first of which reached an altitude of 31 miles and flew around 217 miles. The second missile was even more concerning, reaching the same altitude but covering a distance of around 250 miles, according to Japan's Ministry of Defense. According to North Korea, this so-called drill was aimed to send a clear message to the enemies who challenged the country with strategic nuclear assets despite its repeated warnings. But despite all these moves and counter-moves, North Korea wasn't able to assess the battlefield performance of its newest generation of short-range ballistic missiles, particularly against Western defenses. That is, until the 2023 incident in Ukraine. So that's one of the answers to why North Korea chose to test its nuclear weapons in Ukraine. But this is far from the most prominent factor influencing North Korea's decision. You see, Kim Jong-un sees the country's military nuclear program as its strongest guarantee of survival. That's why he needs the world to see what nuclear capabilities North Korea possesses. And what better place to do this than the country currently being watched by virtually the entire world? Security experts say this high-profile battlefield exposure has one goal: to afford North Korea new proliferation opportunities. Of course, these opportunities and North Korea's illicit arms business go hand in hand. Given how much this business is trailed off in recent years, it shouldn't be surprising that Kim wants to leverage the global spotlight and send a clear message. North Korea is still a force to be reckoned with in the realm of illicit arms trade. This message is clearly directed at nations without access to legitimate arms sales, seeking to bolster their military capabilities amid the global rise in militarization, like the world's most sinister commercial. Now, North Korea's illicit arms business might be a priority in 2024, but the country is by no means a stranger to the shadowy world of arms dealings. It is quite the opposite, actually. North Korea has a rather extensive history with illicit arms that stretch back decades. The story starts sometime in the mid-1970s when North Korea supplied modest amounts of military equipment to the following countries: Angola, Benin, Burkina Faso, the Congo, Ethiopia, Ghana, Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe. As you can see, North Korea's first clients were primarily third world countries that lacked the resources and the time to develop their own military capabilities. Not much changed during the 1980s in regard to the clientele. However, North Korea was now a significant arms exporter of inexpensive yet reliable weapons. At that same time, the Middle East was arguably the biggest market for these arms, with Libya, Egypt, and Syria among the most prominent buyers. However, no other Middle Eastern country could compare to Iran, which purchased as much as 90% of North Korea's arms exports at the height of the Iran-Iraq War. Though there are no precise figures on North Korea's arms trade at the time, rough estimates suggest the country earned over $4 billion from 1981 to the end of 1989. This trade undoubtedly peaked in 1982 when arms sales accounted for almost 37% of North Korea's total exports. The 90s were just as lucrative for North Korea, as the country's gross national product reached $22.3 billion in 1995. Here are just some of the highlights. In 1993, Iran paid North Korea $500 million for missile development and technology for nuclear weapons. The next year, North Korea struck a lucrative $100 million deal with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or Zaire as it was called then, concerning the country's missiles. However, something shifted in the 2000s. Due to economic mismanagement and some natural disasters, North Korea's gross national product dropped to $15.7 billion in 2001. At $650 million, legitimate exports weren't bringing in as much money, which is why the country has increasingly turned to illegal trade. Drug trafficking alone brought in between $500 million and $1 billion. Meanwhile, the sales of missiles earned Pyongyang over $560 million. Looking at these figures, it shouldn't be surprising that the Western world started increasingly worrying about North Korea's threatening behavior. So, on May 31, 2003, President George W. Bush announced the Proliferation Security Initiative, or PSI, aimed at curbing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and their related sea, air, and land delivery systems. Initially, 11 countries signed the Statement of Interdiction Principles that guides PSI cooperation. However, the PSI has since grown substantially, now including the endorsement from 105 nations worldwide. Given that North Korea was the principal catalyst for the initiative, it's only fitting that the primary focus of the PSI in the 2000s was to counteract the nation's illicit practices. To achieve this goal, the PSI and its participant nations targeted North Korea before and after the PSI's official establishment, including, in December 2002, the Spanish Navy intercepted a freighter from North Korea carrying a cargo of 15 Scud missiles, 15 conventional warheads with 550 pounds of high explosives, 23 fuel tanks of nitric acid, and 85 drums of chemicals. In June 2009, the U.S. Navy tracked a North Korean vessel believed to be heading to Myanmar, causing it to turn around. In September 2009, South Korea seized North Korea's containers crossing the port of Busan. The containers transported special clothing used to protect against chemical weapons. In December 2009, Thailand stopped a North Korean shipment carrying mixed conventional arms and missile technology. While these efforts might have slowed down North Korea's proliferation efforts, they certainly didn't stop them. In the midst of all the surveillance, the country's first nuclear test took place in October 2006. The second took place in May 2009, yielding a 3 to 4 times more powerful blast. The nuclear testing continued into the 2010s. North Korea's third nuclear test, an explosion of approximately 6 to 7 kilotons in February 2013, caused the UN to introduce tightened sanctions against the country, banning it from shipping or receiving cargo related to its nuclear and missile programs. North Korea conducted 3 more successful tests since, so it's safe to say these sanctions have not been entirely effective in deterring the country's pursuit of nuclear capabilities. But then again, given how beneficial nuclear weapons can be for North Korea, the country's perseverance in pursuing these capabilities makes perfect sense. On the one hand, nuclear weapons give North Korea the upper hand in a potential war and a bargaining chip in regional and global negotiations. On the other, these weapons are, as Toby Dalton, the co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment, puts it, bluntly, a cash cow. Under current circumstances, North Korea can command a premium for its nuclear systems, earning it considerable financial gains. But has the country really introduced nuclear warhead-bearing missiles into a war in Ukraine to earn more money from illicit trade? On the surface, the answer is yes, but that's not all there is to the story. After all, North Korea has always had an ulterior motive when selling arms. For instance, the country gained a hard currency, an alternative oil source, and access to restricted technology through Middle Eastern arms sales. An arms deal with Peru in 1986 for approximately 10,000 AK-47s increased North Korea's visibility in Latin America. When it comes to the country's cooperation with the Warsaw Pact, the primary goal was to pursue solidarity with the socialist bloc countries. So what is it this time? Hard currency? Political chits? Offset agreements? Unfortunately for North Korea, the real reason behind this desire for the world to see and purchase its nuclear weapons is much more desperate this time. Simply put, these sales are needed to boost the North Korean economy, which is still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. Here's how dire the situation is. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the North Korean economy has shrunk for 3 consecutive years, in 2020, 2021, and 2022. The country's gross domestic product, or GDP, plummeted by 4.5% in 2020. Its worst fall since 1997, dropped 0.1% in 2021, and plunged 0.2% in 2022. While North Korea has never really pulled incredible economic growth figures, it's also never reported a 3-year consecutive drop since the Bank of Korea started publishing its estimates in 1991. North Korea's trade volume also took a massive hit during these years. In 2019, before the pandemic, North Korea's trade volume was approximately $3.25 billion. In 2020, this figure plunged a remarkable 73.5%, followed by a 17.4% drop in 2021, while 2022 saw an impressive rebound of 122.3% to $1.59 billion. This figure is still far from the country's glory days and not even in the same realm as its southern neighbor's $1.4 trillion trade volume. With this in mind, it becomes obvious why Ukraine has been chosen as a test site for North Korea's nuclear weapons. Such dramatic economic troubles and discrepancies call for drastic moves. So let's recap. For now, we have 3 answers as to why North Korea is testing nuclear weapons in Ukraine: to assert dominance, to test out its systems against Western adversaries, and potentially earn lots of money from illicit sales. But there's one more reason behind choosing Ukraine as a nuclear test site. Just remember who's standing opposite Ukraine on the battlefield, and you'll be able to guess this critical reason. That's right, it's Russia. Now it's obvious what Russia has to gain by using North Korean weapons in Ukraine, but what does North Korea have to gain by cooperating with Russia? It's simple, really. The move sends a clear message to potential buyers who might be on the fence about conducting arms business with North Korea. Russia, a UN Security Council permanent member, will do nothing to interdict any of these transactions shipped through its borders. Similarly, it probably won't greenlight any potential UN punishments against the buyers. And let's not forget another thing. Russia is still the country with the highest number of nuclear weapons, with the figure exceeding 6,000 warheads. So if the country that has produced as many nuclear weapons as Russia is using North Korea's missile systems, they're likely to only get better. As North Korea and Russia become increasingly close against the backdrop of this war in Ukraine, Kim is seemingly emboldened to ramp up his country's arms production. So let's see what they're dealing with, especially if North Korea plans to continue using Ukraine as a showroom floor for selling these arms to other nations worldwide, most of which aren't exactly known for promoting peace and stability. Given the country's penchant for secrecy, North Korea's precise production capabilities are difficult to assess, but there are still estimates that can help you get a better picture of the potential scale of North Korea's arms production. For starters, the country is believed to operate over 300 munitions factories, as well as 100 civilian facilities that can shift to weapons production as needed. Since weapons manufacturing in North Korea is state-controlled, Kim can simply fill these factories with workers as he pleases whenever he wants to ramp up production. But how many nuclear warheads has the country produced so far? According to a 2023 study by the Institute for Science and International Security, this figure could range anywhere between 31 and 96. Since a 2022 estimate put this figure at 20 to 30 assembled warheads, the potential drastic increase is nothing short of alarming. But what's perhaps even more alarming is the shift in North Korea's nuclear doctrine. In the beginning, this doctrine was clear: no first use. However, as of 2022, North Korea considers itself a nuclear state. So, in September that same year, the country introduced a new law giving Kim the right to use preemptive nuclear strikes. Under the law, the country's supreme leader has all decisive powers over its nuclear weapons and can use them in these scenarios. There's the threat of an imminent nuclear strike. The country's leadership, existence, or people are under threat. The country needs to gain the upper hand during a war. North Korea's missiles can even be launched automatically if the command and control system is threatened. But let's try to ignore this impending doom and go back to the weapons North Korea will possibly sell. Here are some of the missiles the country reportedly possesses: Hwasong-5, 6, and KN-02 short-range ballistic missiles, KN-23, KN-24, and 25 solid-fueled tactical ballistic missiles, 2 of which were tested in Ukraine, Hwasong-7, Hwasong-9, and Pukutsong-2 medium-range ballistic missiles, Hwasong-10 and Hwasong-12 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, and Hwasong-15, 17, and 18 intercontinental ballistic missiles. In March 2023, Kim Jong-un called for his scientists to increase production of weapons-grade materials. Of course, this newly established cooperation with Russia could provide the raw materials North Korea otherwise struggles to access, supercharging its production capabilities further. Given North Korea's tests in Ukraine, arguably the most alarming potential new developments is a warhead called the Hwasan-31. The name of this warhead is based on the Korean word for volcano, which already spells trouble. Of course, this dive will do nothing to diminish the gravity of the situation, as some experts suggest this weapon could fit on multiple systems, including the newly unveiled nuclear-capable underwater drones. The Hwasan-31 size is no more reassuring. At 19 inches wide and 35 inches long, this warhead suggests North Korea might have successfully created a miniaturized warhead that could fit virtually any system. To make matters worse, South Korean experts believe that North Korea is moving closer to its next full-fledged nuclear test. Potential success in this test could be the final proof buyers need to turn to North Korea for their arms needs. Either way, the tests in Ukraine are likely to continue as North Korea seeks to showcase its military prowess on the global stage. North Korea isn't exactly the friendliest country in the world. It has few allies. Ever since it was formed in the aftermath of the Korean War, it's been ruled by one family and 3 men, all members of the Kim family, who ruled it as a hardline authoritarian communist state. The small country is known for its aggressive foreign policy, waging small-scale attacks against its neighbor South Korea, taking foreign hostages, and developing a nuclear program that it repeatedly uses to menace foreign countries, especially the United States. Even most other countries that don't have friendly relations with the US shy away from North Korea due to how unpredictable the country can be, with a few big exceptions. In recent years, China's taken a more moderate stance in terms of its economic policy. The massive country run by the Chinese Communist Party since the days of Mao Zedong opened its economy and repealed the infamous one-child policy. But there's one area where it hasn't moderated at all: foreign policy. Rather, China's actually begun to take a more aggressive posture in the region. They've expanded into the South China Sea, building artificial islands for military bases in international waters and other countries' territorial waters, and repeatedly threatened the small island nation of Taiwan and its allies. China and North Korea have more in common than just a border, and they might be tighter than ever. Under Xi Jinping, the current leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and now essentially China's dictator for life, China's been seeking to surpass the United States as the world superpower. Most analysts say they have a long way to go before this is even a remote possibility, but China's tactics indicate they're playing the long game. This includes trying to create global alliances with countries opposed to U.S. hegemony, including outlaw nations like Iran, Russia, and yes, even North Korea. But the relationship between the two neighboring countries is complex and has been for a long time. China had close relations with the Korean government in exile during the period where Japan occupied Korea. But when communism swept through the nation, things took a very different turn. As soon as the communists began battling for control of Korea, China recognized them as the country's legitimate government. While the Korean War ended in a stalemate with two countries and a demilitarized zone, neither Korea has ever recognized the other as a legitimate government. Both recognized themselves as the rightful government of all Korea over 70 years later. But Korea might be a little more than a pawn in a much bigger game. As Korea was part of China's future plans in the 1950s, China was part of the Soviet Union, and the leaders of that massive superpower largely directed China's foreign policy in the early years. However, distance would be growing between the two, and China soon invested more heavily in Korea. Chinese forces battled US and UN-backed forces in Korea, although both sides held off on the heavier artillery to prevent the outbreak of World War III. As the war settled down, the new regime in Pyongyang, led by the first member of the Kim clan, Kim Il-sung, received heavy support from China and the Soviet Union's Eastern Bloc. But things have gotten much more complicated since. China and North Korea, as the most powerful communist countries in Asia, were natural allies. But as early as the 1960s, conflict was starting to arise. At first, it was actually North Korea that seemed to be the more conservative, with Mao's brutal policies in the Cultural Revolution being criticized. There were even brief armed clashes across the border in 1969. However, the rise of new leadership offered promise. Mao's successor reached out to Pyongyang to apologize for some of the tension, but when Deng Xiaoping took the helm in the 1980s, conflict rose again. Deng was a reformer and wanted to open China's economy, while North Korea was still staunchly communist. And no one lives forever. Kim Il-sung was a hardliner, but he was also a veteran of statecraft. While North Korea was highly repressive under him, people largely knew what to expect from the patriarch of the Kim dynasty. But he passed away in 1994 after decades in power and was replaced by the only logical successor. That would be his son, Kim Jong-il. Raised in the halls of power and taught to think of himself as the inevitable leader of the one-party state, Kim Jong-il quickly proved to be more eccentric and volatile than his father, and the buildup of tension between the two regimes wouldn't stop there. China under Deng Xiaoping and later Hu Jintao was interested in playing the long game, and that included opening trade and diplomatic relations with South Korea. That was a massive problem for North Korea and led to a brief Cold War between the two. During this period, North Korea's economy heavily declined. China wound up subsidizing trade with them to avoid a worsening famine and to avoid a mass influx of North Korean refugees at their border. When the younger Kim took over, he stepped up his country's nuclear program and would soon be taking a bigger role on the world stage. And with another change in power would come even more changes. Under Kim Jong-il, North Korea's reputation as a radical wild card increased, especially once the country got the nuclear bomb in 2006. Heavily sanctioned but defiant, North Korea leaned heavily on its few remaining allies as it maintained its insular aggressive foreign policy. That included China, but the alliance was hardly rock solid, especially once Kim Jong-il unexpectedly died in 2011 after an illness. His replacement once again was his son, Kim Jong-un, who took office at only 29 years old. Once again raised under the North Korean system, he was seen as the most unpredictable and extreme North Korean leader yet, and China was not enthusiastic about dealing with him. While only a few years later, China and North Korea had proclaimed a year of friendship and tightened relations, in 2012, Hu Jintao met with dissident members of the North Korean leadership that planned to replace the youngest Kim with his more stable brother. One of the plotters was Kim Jong-un's uncle, who would later be executed for treason. China failed to inform Kim of the plot against his life, and he's never trusted them fully since. North Korea stepped up their aggressive foreign policy even against China, capturing Chinese fishing boats and holding them and their crew for ransom. As the nuclear program in North Korea steps up, scientists in the nation aim to build a missile that can hit anywhere in the world. China's become increasingly vocal about its differences with its radical neighbor, often seeing North Korea as a nuisance that distracts it from its largest goals. And despite that, they can't really quit being friends. Why does China put up with North Korea and maintain them as an ally, despite what are usually one-sided provocations from North Korea? Under Kim Jong-un, the Hermit Kingdom is more belligerent than ever and has even fewer allies. But despite this, China continues to maintain robust economic relations with North Korea. Many Chinese companies are sanctioned by the US for violating sanctions against North Korea. That might be changing. By 2017, China was backing sanctions against North Korea, and North Korean state media was publicly attacking China. But under Xi Jinping, things might be reversing, with the powerful Chinese leader visiting North Korea and North Korea backing China on internationally condemned moves like the Xinjiang concentration camps and the political takeover of Hong Kong. So why do they keep coming back to each other? That might be best explained by an old-school cop movie trope. You've all seen the interrogation, the criminal is in the holding cell, and the two cops come in. One offers the suspect a cup of coffee and the other is holding a phone book ready to tune him up if he's not compliant. It's a highly effective tactic, at least in the movies, and China and North Korea might be trying to play good cop, bad cop on a global scale. North Korea, under the newest member of the Kim family, fits the role naturally, often releasing belligerent statements of nuclear annihilation for the slightest provocation. China, meanwhile, is there to calm them down and keep North Korea under control, just so long as the US keeps China happy. And like it or not, North Korea and China really can't distance themselves from each other. North Korea and China share a land border of over 1,400 kilometers, North Korea's most accessible border. The border with South Korea is marred by the massive demilitarized zone, a dangerous no-go zone for civilians, while the sea borders are highly guarded. That means the land border with China is the most convenient spot for travel and has been a popular spot for refugees. During the 1950s and the 1960s, many people flooded into North Korea from China, something that seems unthinkable now. The border from North Korea is highly guarded, but a few high-profile refugees have managed to escape to China. Same goes for trade, as the port city of Dandong on the North Korean border is where much of the trade between the two countries happens. And China has itself kept heavily invested in North Korea. Aid to North Korea makes up almost half of all Chinese foreign aid, making China North Korea's top trade partner. Without China, North Korea would likely fully descend into famine again, with no way to get basic supplies and no one to sell its goods to, which include a healthy store of metals and rare earth minerals from its mining industry. China also provides vital financial support to North Korea, although its largest bank has participated in cutting off North Korea's banks from the international banking system. So China continues to send mixed messages, joining in the international community in key sanctions while also regularly helping North Korea subvert those very same sanctions. But the bond between the two of them are a long way off from what they were during the Cold War. North Korea needs China, but China might need North Korea too. North Korea and South Korea have been a flashpoint for decades, but now a different flashpoint might be putting it out of the spotlight. The tensest spot in all of Asia at the moment is Taiwan, the prosperous island nation that gained independence during the Chinese Civil War. While mainland China was taken over by the communists, Taiwan was kept by the pro-Western military forces and in the decades since has transformed into a powerful economy and a thriving democracy. Much like in Korea, neither side recognizes the other. Taiwan's government maintains that it was the legitimate government of China, and China maintains that Taiwan is a rogue province that will be brought under its leadership by any means necessary. And the beat of war drums are getting louder. As Western nations increase diplomatic relationships with Taiwan and deepen economic cooperation while Taiwan continues to ramp up production of the world's largest factories making essential semiconductors, China becomes increasingly belligerent. They've regularly conducted war games in Taiwan's waters, bullied Taiwan's pro-Western neighbors like Japan, and made belligerent threats toward the United States should they defend Taiwan. And in a case like that, having a belligerent bad cop on a leash could be very helpful. Could North Korea join China in a war over Taiwan? No one is really able to predict this, given how insular and unpredictable the country and particularly Kim Jong-un are. However, South Korea is likely to be strongly on the side of the US and Taiwan in a regional war, and might even be tempted to join the fight. It would be strongly beneficial to China if one of the region's strongest militaries was suddenly tied up by an invasion coming from the north. While North Korea going all out and attacking Seoul might draw the US into a war to defend it, it would also divide the US focus in the region. While it's not likely China could directly order North Korea to aid it in this way, the chaos of the war might give it some influence, and there is no doubt that North Korea would love to get a chance to get revenge on its neighbors in the hated South. But China's biggest investment might actually go much further north. North Korea and South Korea is a slow-boiling conflict that's never quite ended. Taiwan is heating up but remains a Cold War at the moment. However, there is one war that's gotten very hot, and all the world is focused on it. Russia v. Ukraine has dominated the headlines for the last year, with Russia at first expected to have an easy victory. It didn't go well, and Ukraine performed an underdog run that not only made history but captivated the world and pulled in a lot of help from the Western world. Russia and China are closely aligned, with both seeking to influence the world away from U.S. influence and toward their sphere. As the war began, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin expressed their support for their partnership, and Xi seemed to approve of Putin's assault on Ukraine. But then something happened. Russia started losing badly. First, the invasion stalled when the Russian attempt to encircle Kyiv failed and Ukraine maintained control over the majority of the country. Once it became clear that this was a war and not a fast and simple conquest, Western aid started pouring into Ukraine, and Russia was hit with devastating sanctions that resembled those put on North Korea on a much larger scale. Russia found itself cut off from the global economy, desperate to get not just supplies but the weaponry it would need to keep waging its war, and it found itself with only a few allies. Russia found itself relying on weapons and military supplies from fellow outlaw nations Iran and North Korea, both of whom it saw as a proxy war between Russia and NATO, and loved the idea of weakening the US and its allies. Other pro-Russian countries like Venezuela, Syria, and Belarus had little in the way of resources to provide given their own situations. But there was one country sitting on the fence: China. Outwardly, China was all in favor of the war, making supportive comments toward Russia and even offering to negotiate a peace deal that would likely partition Ukraine. But there was one thing they would not do. China didn't participate in the sanctions against Russia and kept its economy with the country fully open. Russia could rely on China to deliver military supplies, resources, and other goods, with one exception: lethal aid. China has so far refused to give Russia any weapons or get directly involved in the war in any way. And as Russia's supplies get desperately low, Vladimir Putin is getting increasingly impatient with his neighbor to the south. But despite this, Xi Jinping has stayed firm, frequently hinting that China might be about to start providing weapons to keep the US on its toes, but never actually doing it, even as Russia runs out of key supplies. And they might have an out. China's biggest reason for not providing weapons to Russia is probably self-interest. Doing so might open them up to serious secondary sanctions that could harm the Chinese economy, and they have a lot more to lose than Russia or North Korea does. China's economy is the second biggest in the world, and it does an enormous amount of trade with the countries that are currently arming the Ukrainian defenders. If it firmly gets on the side of Russia and turns this into a full proxy war, that could all come crashing down and stop decades of economic progress in its tracks. It might be worth it to create a new world order, but right now, Russia looks like a loser. And China isn't willing to risk the whole house of cards if it's not confident that Russia can finish the job even with Chinese weapons. Which is why an old frenemy might be able to give China a different route. Unlike China, North Korea has not been shy about which side it falls on in the Russia-Ukraine war. North Korea's foreign policy is based around one thing: opposing the US and its allies, and it's been a consistent, strong supplier of Russia since the start of the war. It's provided the massive country with both military supplies and deadly weapons like guns, missiles, and drones. What is the rest of the world going to do to them? Sanction them? North Korea is already under many of the same sanctions as Russia. Both North Korea and Iran have little to fear from the United States, barring a massive escalation. But China only has outsized influence on one of these countries. Is China actually influencing North Korea on what aid they're giving to Russia? It's impossible to know, but relations between the two countries have warmed in the recent years, with China largely being North Korea's lifeline to the outside world. If China wanted to coordinate its Russia strategy through North Korea, odds are that North Korea would have little choice but to listen, especially if they both came from the same place of wanting to see the US badly humbled in the biggest conflict in the world. And so North Korea might have secretly made itself indispensable. China's played a delicate game over the last few decades, especially under Xi Jinping, as it attempts to be a good cop and a bad cop at the same time. As the good cop, it seeks to expand its influence overseas through financial investments. This includes both trade deals with massive nations, thanks to its robust manufacturing sector, and heavy investments in developing nations. In Africa in particular, China is opening many factories and offering jobs to the residents. Its economy continues to grow, although there are many warning signs about troubled waters thanks to its aging population and increasing isolation politically. And that last part is largely due to the flip side of the coin. China has maintained an aggressive posture in foreign policy, and not just when it comes to Taiwan. In the South China Sea, China continues to encroach on its neighbors. It's increasingly threatening toward U.S.-aligned neighbors and cracks down on anyone who speaks out against some of its widely condemned policy, like the Uyghur concentration camps in Xinjiang. But most of its threats are largely bluster. Its threat to shoot down Nancy Pelosi's plane if she visited Taiwan on a diplomatic visit, killing the Speaker of the House at the time, would not be seen as a diplomatic incident, it would be seen as a declaration of war. And when China's bluff was called, they backed down. Which is why China might need North Korea more than ever. China and North Korea maintain a through line of trade, which could be a key way for China to provide lethal aid to Russia without actually committing to it in the eyes of the world. Shipments between China and North Korea can't be inspected without the consent of either country, and neither is about to agree. That means China could easily send weapons to North Korea, allow North Korea to send them to Russia, and maintain deniability. While this would be of a smaller scale than if China actually committed to aiding Russia militarily, it might serve China's interests. After all, China doesn't have any reason to really care about the fate of Ukraine, but it does want to keep the US and NATO tied up in Eastern Europe, sending more and more military resources and draining their stores, because China might be waiting for the right moment to make a move. Many people think China is running out of time to invade Taiwan, for a lot of reasons. Its population is aging, its youth are now more willing to question the country's policies, and a full invasion with a draft could see a revolt similar to the one Putin is putting down in Russia. Additionally, while Taiwan's semiconductor facilities are the grand prize of any battle over Taiwan, TSMC is increasingly diversifying around the world, opening up new facilities in friendly countries, making it much harder for China to seize control of the industry and use it to blackmail the world. And as the war in Ukraine winds down, the US and its allies could move a large amount of their resources to defend Taiwan, a war that China could likely not win outright. Which means that China might be ready to unleash the dogs. Right now, China is the most powerful country in the region, but it might not be the most feared. North Korea's increasingly belligerent rhetoric makes it a good distraction and a convenient shield for China in the event of a war. North Korea could attack troops in the region in solidarity with China, or mount a full assault on South Korea to open up a new front in the war. The only thing that is for sure is that China's outreach to North Korea in recent years isn't for neighborly reasons. It's because Xi Jinping has made a concentrated effort to cultivate North Korea as an asset. So, is a new Russia-China-North Korea axis forming? In a word, probably no. There are three countries along with Iran who have been cooperating. They ultimately have only one thing in common: they hate the US and want to weaken it. But that doesn't mean their interests align in other areas, particularly in the case of China, North Korea, and Russia. All three have territorial conflicts with each other that have even escalated to armed conflict in the past. But China is playing a high-wire act, trying to create a new world order where the opposition has equal power to the United States. But it wouldn't be an equal alliance. It would have China at the top, and that would allow China to continue expanding its sphere of influence in the South China Sea, Africa, and beyond. All it would take was a few key strategic victories, which might require the help of some allies in the region. But to get there, the unstable, volatile country of the Korean Peninsula that keeps shooting at its neighbors might be more than just strategically useful, it might be indispensable. Kim Jong-un has made no shortage of enemies, both domestic and foreign. But if they'd like to get a shot at the notorious dictator, they'll have their work cut out for them. Because the protection of that North Korean leader is simply insane. World leaders being protected, well, is nothing new. The United States president has an entire agency, the Secret Service, tasked with protecting him. Their homes tend to be well fortified as well, for a good reason. A mentally disturbed attacker managed to break into the Canadian Prime Minister's house in 1995. But even by those standards, Kim Jong-un is particularly vigilant. And it's nothing new. The North Korean leaders are protected by a team resembling an elite military squad, more than bodyguards. That's because it's not just about protection, it's about a show of force. It became very clear in 2018 when Kim Jong-un attempted a diplomatic summit in Singapore. He was meeting the then US President Donald Trump as the two tried to hash out tricky issues. But as the North Korean leader approached the site, onlookers noticed something bizarre. His presidential car was flanked by a team of sharp-dressed bodyguards, all of them fit-looking young men wearing black formal suits, and they were running alongside the car, keeping pace. These strange runners are a part of a much bigger organization. The simple-sounding name, Central Party Office No. 6, is a cover for an elite team of bodyguards, and it's not easy to get in. You've got to pass a lot of tests to even be considered, starting with one you can't cheat on: height. The team has to be roughly the same height as the North Korean leader, possibly to give the right vantage point to protect him. or possibly because Kim Jong-un doesn't want to be surrounded by taller people. No one who is overweight or has facial scars that make them stand out are considered, and 4 eyes need not apply. Anyone with a visual impairment is disqualified immediately. And that's before we get into the skills you'll need. Before being put on the high-risk duty of protecting the North Korean leader, the candidates will be tested in skills including marksmanship and martial arts. They need to be able to protect Kim at both close range and long range, which is similar to the test Secret Service agents undergo before being placed on presidential duty. They're also put through an intense background check where the last 2 generations of their family are scrutinized to make sure they have no conflicts of interest or other potential weak points that a blackmailer could exploit. But back to Kim Jong-un and his strenuous requirements for security. This is considered one of the most prestigious positions in North Korea. After all, you're getting to be near the current leader of the Kim dynasty all day. Who wouldn't want that? Don't answer that if you're in North Korea. And most likely to be chosen, of course, are already insiders. Distant relatives of the Kim family are often chosen as long as they're in the favor of the regime, as are those from elite North Korean families or those whose parents are trusted advisors of the Kim family. But there is one key difference between this and the Secret Service. Saying no to this high-risk, high-profile position is not an option. That's because members of the North Korean military go where they're told and don't have the luxury of refusing orders. That's the same in most militaries. But North Korea has one of the widest-reaching conscription laws in the world. Anyone is eligible to be pulled into active duty at any time. Men in North Korea are conscripted across the board, with them being inducted into the military at 14 and beginning their training at 17 for 3 years. So just about every man in North Korea has some combat training, and a surprising number of women do as well. While not all women are drafted, the regime maintains the right to conscript any they think has promise, and that gives North Korea one of the most outsized militaries in the world. North Korea has a population of only 25.5 million, the 55th largest in the world, but its military is the 4th largest in the world by active military personnel. Most of them stay at home, with elite units traveling with Kim around the world to protect him. By conscripting every North Korean male at an early age, the regime can study the skills for years and pinpoint where they'll best serve the Kim family. While most never get close to the presidential limo, you can bet that any who does has been thoroughly vetted. But the security that people see abroad is nothing compared to what awaits back home. Most people who see the North Korean security teams assume that he has his own secret service, but the reality is much crazier than that. A whole unit of the North Korean military is devoted to protecting Kim Jong-un. The elite team running along the car is a tiny offshoot of this unit, chosen for their appearance and the image they project. But the actual North Korean security system is one of the most complex military teams in the world, with a shocking staff of over 100,000 members, and they all have their eyes on protecting one man. The official name of the unit is Supreme Guard Command, and everything about it is to the specifications of the Kim family. Currently overseen by General Jong Rin, it has a designation number of 99, a number formation considered lucky in North Korea. And it's hard not to feel lucky when you're protected by a team like this. Its history dates back to before the Korean War, shortly after the Kim dynasty was founded. Originally, Kim Il-sung was protected by a division of the State Security Department, and that continued until the 1990s, but there was one problem. They kept trying to stage coups. Needless to say, this wouldn't do, and the second Kim leader, Kim Jong-il, quickly reorganized the guard. He cut off dozens of officers and replaced them with loyalists, giving himself a massive private bodyguard unit over 200 men. Today, it's technically part of the Korean People's Army ground force and has around 6 divisions, 3 for combat and 1 for construction. As for the bodyguard divisions, the regime isn't sharing too many details on that, but it's believed the whole team has at least 95,000 members and probably more. And every time there's a new leader, the structure changes. Kim Il-sung had his own dedicated unit, and his son, Kim Jong-il, added his own. Did Kim Jong-un create his own private division or inherit his father's? It's not clear, but it's not hard to see why he would. Loyalists to the previous leader, who had served him for decades, might not agree with everything the new kid on the block is doing. They might even think that they could do a better job. So the notoriously paranoid Kim family is likely to keep replacing the staff as needed and retiring the previous guys, just so they don't feel the need to keep watching their back. And speaking of watching your back, they're probably watching yours right now. The Supreme Guard Command is based in Pyongyang near Kim Jong-un's headquarters, but they're probably never far away from anyone in North Korea. They have camps around the country to keep an eye on all major military and party figures. And this way, they combine the function of the Secret Service with groups like the FBI that keep an eye out for chatter that could endanger the president. Of course, in North Korea, the kind of chatter that could get someone a visit from the command is probably a lot less threatening. And in the event of a crisis, they're prepared. The Supreme Guard Command has close ties with other military groups within the country and has access to another 100,000 soldiers in case of a serious attack on the capital or Kim Jong-un's location. If they're called into action, they'll be ready to move the leader in a hurry to deploy armored vehicles to defend the location. The people high up in command have access to classified info needed to secure the current leader, including hidden bunkers that can protect him from any attack from the air. And other units have more specific purposes. Having 100,000 people to protect one man would be overkill, even for the Kim family, so they're put to work in unique ways. Teams are sent to protect not just the Kim Palace, but shrines dedicated to the departed leaders. They man checkpoints controlling access to zones in the capital city. They provide protection to other North Korean elites when needed, and supply medical care that far exceeds the kind offered in the country's hospitals. And because all work and no play makes Kim a dull boy, they handle much of the country's smuggling operations, helping Kim Jong-un get his hands on luxury goods that he's banned from importing due to international sanctions. Other units are there in the event of a crisis. The team has a communications unit that monitors telephone and internet communications and wires Kim's orders to the military when needed. This unit is heavily involved in spycraft, but in the event of an invasion would likely be the ones relaying Kim's orders for how to proceed. That means they'd be the ones giving the orders to fire the nukes. And then there's the Rapid Response Force, a heavily militarized unit of trained soldiers, armored cars, and heavy weapons that has one goal: put down a coup and keep Kim safe by any means necessary. If they storm into a place, the odds are good a heavy shootout is coming. And there are more layers all the way down. This massive security force has smaller and smaller units until you get to the small, secretive unit known as Office Number 6. They're tasked with protecting Kim Jong-un and his inner circle. They reportedly have about 1,200 members, about the size of a single battalion. They report directly to Kim Jong-un's personal secretariat and coordinate all his public appearances. It's not easy to get close to North Korea's supreme leader, which means that anyone who makes it into the group has the inner circle's trust. And getting that trust takes a lot of sacrifices. After the candidates are screened for appearance, physical capabilities, and loyalty to the party, their backgrounds are checked for songbun. This is the unofficial class structure in North Korea. Your ranking is based on your ancestors' and relatives' conduct in the country and determines every area of your life in North Korea. This ranges from job opportunities to even food rations. And you'd better believe that only those with the highest ranking in the system are considered to get into the inner circle of the security system. And what comes next is even more shocking when you consider that this starts with teenagers. Those chosen as candidates for the security forces say goodbye to their names and past identity. They're given an ID number and head to a special training camp. They're put through an intensive 6-month program and go through 2 years of total training. Not only are they trained in combat, but they have to do regular 25K marches in full gear to make sure they have the endurance for the task. It might sound like a particularly brutal summer camp, but don't expect to keep the tradition of sending letters home. Contact with family members is completely forbidden, and only one member of each family is allowed to serve in the elite unit. This is because once you join Kim Jong-un's elite bodyguard team, he wants you to have exactly one priority: keeping him safe. No connections will be tolerated. Your family was the past, and your role in the security forces is the future. But hey, at least you'll look super awesome running alongside his car. Just don't lag behind. If we're lucky, long-range artillery will bombard military bases and highly populated areas in Seoul, snuffing out hundreds of thousands of lives in a matter of hours. As the DMZ becomes a war zone swarmed by an overwhelming ground force, a fleet of Cold War-era prop planes choke the skies, dropping elite special forces soldiers on the other side of the South Korean border, where they engage in sabotage and tactical elimination of key targets. Meanwhile, the rest of the world scrambles to figure out what's going on and prepares for an all-out war. And if we're unlucky, the DPRK lets a nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missile off the chain, activating the United States' nuclear umbrella and perhaps even triggering the end of the world as we know it. Either of these could be North Korea's plan for offensive war, hoping to dominate and reabsorb the U.S.'s key ally, South Korea. But which devastating outcome is more likely? And is a potential war avoidable or inevitable? In July 2023, Kim Jong-un stood proudly at the head of the Kim Il-sung Square in Pyongyang. Red and blue filled the square, with thousands of soldiers coming together in an incredibly tightly choreographed display of unity, discipline, and strength. Flanking the North Korean leader were representatives from Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chinese Communist Party Politburo member Li Hongzhong. The Victory Day parade marked the 70th anniversary of the end of the Korean War, and it was Kim Jong-un's chance to send a message to the world. His nation is only growing stronger. On the world stage, the disarmament of nuclear weapons has been an ongoing project since the end of the Cold War. Even the long-standing differences between the US and Russia have often been put aside in pursuit of the goal of reducing the number of nuclear weapons in the world. But one country's been working as hard as they can to move in the opposite direction. In January 2023, North Korea's rubber-stamped government passed a bill that included yet another year of high military spending. North Korea's economic struggles are no secret to the rest of the world, despite Kim Jong-un's best efforts to pretend otherwise. Yet, they have continued to invest heavily in defense. The U.S. State Department's 2021 World Military Expenditures and Arm Transfers report estimates that in 2019, North Korea spent around $4 billion on its military, roughly 26% of the country's overall GDP. One of the biggest focuses of the spending is the investment in aggressively expanding the Hermit Kingdom's nuclear arsenal. 2022 saw North Korea conducting a record number of weapon tests. It's believed they fired over 70 missiles across the calendar year. The purpose of these tests was apparent, so much so that the government explicitly stated what they were being conducted for: to simulate attacks on South Korea, Japan, and the United States. Of the 70 missile tests, a number were ICBMs, which stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. For a long time, nuclear-capable ICBMs were believed to be out of North Korea's reach. The United States, Russia, China, France, India, the United Kingdom, Israel, and Iran were believed to be the only countries with the capability to launch an intercontinental weapon of that type. In 2012, North Korea proudly showed off a number of ICBMs in their Victory Day parade, which drew heavy scrutiny on the world stage. A team of German weapons experts analyzing the photos picked up on small details like bolts not being secured properly, the noses of the missiles undulating as they were moved, and a lack of consistency from one missile to the next. News articles quickly spread across the Western world, claiming the missiles were fakes, and the general public found the situation mildly amusing. But now, 11 years later, it's clear the situation has changed. At the height of Kim Jong-un's Victory Day parade in July 2023, two trucks carrying Hwasong-17s and Hwasong-18 missiles made an appearance in Pyongyang. This time, they're very much real. The Hwasong-18 missile, North Korea's newest model, has been tested twice in 2023, both times successfully traveling over 1,000 kilometers. But why are we focusing on these missiles specifically? That's because ICBMs are usually armed with nuclear warheads, and what they lack in accuracy, they more than make up for in range, and sometimes the ability to pack multiple warheads in just one missile. These missiles are designed to hit large targets like major cities, and those equipped with multiple independently targeting warheads can even take out multiple cities by themselves. Chemical and biological payloads could also be packed into these missiles, though they have never been used for that purpose before. Since the 1970s, North Korea has been steadily building a stockpile of chemical weapons, which the International Crisis Group estimated in 2009 to be somewhere in the range of 2,500 to 5,000 metric tons of material. If this report is accurate, it would make North Korea's stockpile the third largest in the world behind the US and Russia. So, where could North Korea hit with their Hwasong-18 missile? Their claim is anywhere in the United States. It's difficult to estimate the number of nuclear missiles that North Korea has. Most put it in the range of 40 to 50, but some reports have that number at over 100. This is clearly no longer an idle threat from a country incapable of inflicting real damage. The situation has changed. Another new technology that North Korea has invested heavily in is drones. We've seen in the war in Ukraine how much of a difference consumer-grade drones carrying grenades have made to the battlefield, but North Korea has set its sights on something bigger. This year's Victory Day parade saw flyovers from their brand new unmanned reconnaissance and combat drones. These UAVs seem to be based closely on the large US Global Hawk and the medium-sized US Reaper, and clearly they are stable enough to sustain flight. However, flight is often the simplest system required in a drone. Targeting sensors, data links, and engines, there are a number of very technical components housed in military's UAVs that require a great deal of development. While North Korea committed to upping its drone capabilities in 2021, it may be too soon for them to have developed these complex systems, unless, of course, they've received outside help. Which brings us back to the two men standing shoulder to shoulder with Kim Jong-un at the parade. It was the first time that a Chinese delegate had attended a North Korean parade since before the COVID-19 pandemic. But you would have to go all the way back to 1991 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union for the last time a Russian representative attended. North Korea has been an outspoken proponent of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and according to the state-run news agency Korean Central News Agency, KCNA, North Korean Defense Minister Kang Soon-nam expressed Pyongyang's full support for the just struggle of the Russian army and people to defend the sovereignty and security of their country. During the visit, both North Korea and Russia have denied reports that allege that North Korea has been sending weapons to support the Ukrainian war effort. Yet at the dinner, KCNA reports that Kim Sun-nam read out a message from Vladimir Putin himself, thanking the country for its, quote, support. While Russia and China had previously distanced themselves from North Korea's nuclear program, it appears there's been a sea change, possibly due to rising tensions with the U.S. and the invasion of Ukraine. Both countries have had a substantial military presence in the sea off the Korean peninsula this year as part of the Northern Interaction 2023, a joint military exercise. The goal, according to the Chinese People's Liberation Army, was to strengthen both sides' capabilities of jointly safeguarding regional peace and stability and responding to various security challenges. What they were responding to is no mystery. At the same time, the United States and South Korea were performing their own joint military exercise. It was the first time a U.S. Navy nuclear-capable ballistic missile submarine made port in the region in over 40 years. Tensions have always been high in this part of the world since the end of the Korean War 70 years ago, but with the successful advancements in ICBMs, nuclear stockpile and drone technology, and their overall military strength, North Korea is no longer a threat that can be ignored. With escalating tensions between the West, Russia, and China, the latter parties are clearly starting to view Kim Jong-un as a powerful ally. So, what happens in a worst-case scenario? What would it look like if North Korea actually went to war? Worryingly, this may be more likely than a lot of the world realizes. In 2018, former head of NATO, Navy Admiral James Stavridis, estimated there is a roughly 10% chance of a nuclear war between the US and North Korea, and a 20 to 30% chance of a smaller-scale conflict that would kill over 1 million people. Since then, the situation has of course changed. Donald Trump is no longer in office, COVID-19 has ravaged the world, and Russia has invaded Ukraine. But what has remained consistent throughout the upheaval is North Korea's obsession with building a military capable of attacking the US. The most concerning aspect of a war with North Korea is the main man, Kim Jong-un. As a leader, he's proven to be obsessed with his own personal image and survival. Growing ties between Japan and South Korea only further threaten his rule, and he sees the trilateral US-South Korea-Japanese partnership as a threat to North Korea itself. With constant internal threats as well to his power, he's worked hard to continue the cult of personality started by his grandfather. The bizarre inner workings of North Korea are enough to show anyone that this is a leader who thinks and behaves very differently from the rest of the world. With Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, there have been the occasional concerns about the use of nuclear weapons rumbling beneath the surface, but that's all they've been. Putin has demonstrated that he's happy to keep his nuclear weapons as a deterrent and nothing more for the time being. At no stage in this war have there been real fears of him using any nuclear warheads on Ukraine, but the threat of using them has worked to help the West self-deter from giving Ukraine the aid it truly needs. Kim Jong-un is different. Throughout his time as the leader of North Korea, he has routinely violated international treaties with little regard for the sanctions imposed. The UN inhibits North Korea from nuclear and missile tests, and yet, since 2006, Kim Jong-un has tested nuclear weapons 6 times. The recent ICBM tests also violated those sanctions. He's demonstrated that he has little regard for international treaties and agreements, as well as spent over a decade accumulating a larger and more advanced military force. So it's safe to assume that he would fight a war with real ferocity and few rules. So let's look at a map to get the lay of the land. In the center is North Korea, with its capital Pyongyang here. Immediately surrounding North Korea are China, Japan, Russia, and South Korea. These are the 2nd, 4th, 11th, and 13th largest economies in the world, respectively. Then, all the way across the Pacific Ocean is the United States, the largest economy in the world. The most likely thing to happen first in a war with North Korea would be an attack on Seoul, the capital of South Korea. With a population of just under 10 million, due to Seoul's proximity to the Korean border, it's believed that North Korea has amassed a vast number of rocket launchers and artillery pieces within range of the city. The Congressional Research Service believes up to 10,000 rockets per minute could be fired at the capital. Even the most advanced air defense systems in the world would be overwhelmed by such a barrage. If such an attack were to occur, roughly 300,000 people would be killed on the first day of the conflict. It is entirely possible that as part of that attack, North Korea would deploy chemical or biological weapons on Seoul as well. A report from the U.S. Department of Defense found that they have the capability to produce nerve, blister, blood, and choking agents, including mustard gas and anthrax. The fear with these kinds of attacks is that they would be much harder to detect until it was too late. A single covert agent could very easily make their way into a bustling population center in Seoul. With just 1 kilogram of anthrax and a sprayer, they could administer a lethal dose to hundreds of thousands of people, even up to 1 million, from just one individual. And that's not to mention the methods of getting it into the water supply or pumping it through the sewers. There's a reason these types of weapons are banned internationally. They deliver devastation on an almost unimaginable scale. This is all assuming that he decides not to deploy a nuclear weapon at this stage of the conflict, which is far from guaranteed. While other world leaders see nuclear weapons as a last resort option, Kim Jong-un may use it as his opening gambit, but more on that later. So if artillery bombardment and biological weapons of mass destruction are included, the death toll could easily surpass 1 million on the first day of conflict. Seoul is a highly international city. Kim Jong-un would not simply have killed that many Koreans, he would have killed citizens from all over the world, sparking international outrage. What would the response be? Well, for starters, it would be rapid. For decades, the US and South Korea have been preparing for this exact situation. The first wave of counterattacks would be conducted by precision artillery, specially trained to destroy North Korean artillery firing on Seoul. South Korea maintains a large number of counter-battery units specifically for this mission, but the sheer number of North Korean artillery means Seoul would still be devastated. With close-in air support from the US and South Korean fixed and rotary aviation, though, North Korea's artillery would eventually be hugely attrited, allowing for the evacuation of Seoul. Next would be a focused air campaign to sever the lines of communication leading to the front and to blunt any armored or infantry thrusts across the DMZ. North Korea has the numbers advantage, with an infantry force roughly 3 times larger than the South's. They also have more tanks, but South Korea has far more modern tanks than the North, which are thus far more capable. Numbers matter all on their own, though, as we've seen from the human wave attacks by Russia and Ukraine. And without immediate air support from the South Korean and American Air Force, the South would likely be forced into a fighting retreat immediately on making contact. At this point, it's all but certain that Japan would join the fray as well, taking part in the second phase of the South's counterpunch. Concurrently with the effort to slow or stop the push into the South, South Korea, the US, and possibly even Japanese special forces would immediately launch a decapitation strike against North Korea's leadership. South Korea and the US have trained extensively for the mission, with US Navy SEALs and South Korea's 13th Special Missions Brigade having a special relationship that stretches back years. With 1,000 of South Korea's most elite soldiers, the 13th Special Missions Brigade, supported by US Special Forces, would be responsible for infiltrating Pyongyang to eliminate Kim Jong-un and his regime. But North Korea is still a formidable military. It's estimated that they have roughly 6,500 armored vehicles, 12,000 artillery pieces, and an enormous 1.2 million man army. While this is a significant force, it pales in comparison to the 500,000 active soldiers with 3.1 million in reserve that the Republic of Korea possesses. In addition, the Republic of Korea is a much richer nation with a significantly more advanced military supported by the US. Victor D. Cha, the former director for Asian Affairs in the White House's National Security Council, believes that this disparity is what has led to Kim Jong-un's pursuit of long-range missiles and weapons of mass destruction. An all-out ground war would be a lost cause, and so Cha believes that they have pivoted their strategy. Their ultimate goal would be to, quote, unite the Korean peninsula, absorbing the South into the North's regime. Taking all of that land by force would be unrealistic. Instead, they'll likely inflict massive damage to Seoul and other major cities using long-range weapons with the goal of inflicting terror across the country. Smuggled weapons of mass destruction or even the use of nuclear-tipped missiles targeting South Korea's major ports would attempt to sever the nation off of American or Japanese reinforcements. Under constant missile and WMD assault, North Korea would likely try to force the South Korean government to capitulate. Surrounded by China, Russia, and Japan, and with the US and all their allies being so closely involved, and not forgetting all of the international civilians who will have been killed, North Korea will have the world's attention. It could very easily escalate into World War III, which none of the parties involved would want. There will be a vested interest in finding a peaceful agreement from everybody, which now suddenly gives North Korea much more bargaining power than they have had for a very long time. With chemical and biological weapons wreaking destruction on the Republic of Korea, the North will be in a position to weather the storm and make audacious demands. However, it's unlikely any of these demands would be met. While Russia and China would likely support the North's petitions, the Republic of Korea will be staunchly against any kind of unification that would see them subservient to their neighbors. Culturally and ideologically, the two halves of Korea have drifted so far apart over the last few decades that there is a scarce middle ground left. What's more, the wider world, and the US in particular, will not want to be seen negotiating with terrorists. The only solution for them will be a full-scale ground invasion of North Korea with the goal of eliminating Kim Jong-un and the key members of his party. This would be slow, bloody, and require the US to get directly involved in an intensely volatile situation. Remember as well that North Korea has borders with both China and Russia. Both those superpowers would have the ability to support North Korea with weapons, food, fuel, and resources. If the US set foot in the country, would it be long before Russia or China would do the same? Which ultimately brings us back around to the elephant in the room, or rather the 40 to 50, possibly over 100 elephants in the room. North Korea is a nuclear power. There is an element of chaos to this conflict that takes it out of the realm of predictability. The scenario we've just described assumes Kim Jong-un would not choose to fire a nuclear warhead at Seoul. If he did, the US would be forced to retaliate with nuclear weapons, as South Korea enjoys the protection of America's nuclear umbrella. This guarantee ensures that any nuclear attack on a nation protected by the US is considered an attack on America itself. It was meant to deter the proliferation of nuclear weapons during the Cold War, but now it comes with the risk of North Korea launching nuclear weapons at the US as well. If Kim Jong-un holds on to his weapons at first, then he'll likely want to fire them as soon as the US ground forces invade the country. There's something called the use them or lose them principle. He's sunk his country's economic prospects for years, all to build a handful of nuclear weapons. If troops arrive who are going to take them away from him, he's going to be much more likely to fire them, so all of that money and work doesn't go to waste. He'll also believe he has a valid reason to deploy them, given his country is being invaded. If that happens, well, it's the same again, potential nuclear apocalypse. It seems Kim Jong-un has come to the same realization that a lot of badly behaved school kids come to. The teacher can't do anything to you. You can run around, jump on your desk, draw on the whiteboard, and shout all kinds of obscene language right in your teacher's face, and they can't hit you. All they can do is give you detentions and tell you to stop. Rules and treaties only work when everyone acts reasonably and with a good conscience. As soon as a nation starts to do what they want, it's very difficult to stop them when nuclear weapons are involved. Kim Jong-un is only 39 years old. If his health permits, which it may not, he has decades of leadership still ahead of him. And one thing is clear, he has no intention of changing his ways. Now watch why China will collapse if it invades Taiwan, or check out this video instead.